The lands between holds more than most ever stop to consider. Beneath its broken sky, between its silent ruins and ashen fields, there are layers of meaning that most players pass without ever noticing. These are not hidden paths marked on any map, nor rewards tucked behind familiar puzzles. They are the quiet things, the overlooked, the misunderstood, the almost invisible. And if you find this kind of journey worth returning to, consider subscribing for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. There is a peculiarity buried in how the game tracks your relationship with its most elusive NPC, the mysterious merchant known only as Hermit Merchant, found in a crumbling camp in the mountaintops of the Giants. Most players encounter this figure only briefly, purchasing what they need and moving on without a second glance. But if you linger near him, not speaking, not buying, simply standing in his presence, his dialogue shifts in ways that go almost entirely unnoticed. He speaks about memory, about the things he once believed, about how the cold up here has a way of clarifying thought. These lines do not advance any quest. They do not reward the player with anything tangible. They exist only for those who pause long enough to hear them. That kind of detail, unrewarded, patient, tucked behind stillness, is one of the things that separates the world of Elden Ring from nearly any other game ever made. The designers at From Software did not create a world built entirely around action. They built a world built around attention. And once you begin to see it that way, things you have passed dozens of times without thought start to speak to you differently. The secrets that fewer than 1% of players ever discover are not always locked behind skill or luck. Many of them are locked behind nothing more than the willingness to slow down. There is a set of paintings scattered across the lands between that most players engage with only partially. These are the prophecy paintings, and most know them as the works that lead players to specific outdoor locations where a reward waits upon arrival. Complete the painting quest, collect the reward, move on. That is how most players experience it. But what almost no one realizes is that if you return to the exact location where each painting can be found and stand in the precise spot the painter must have occupied when they created the work, you can look out and see the exact framing the image captures. The same hills, the same light, the same composition, just rendered now in the actual world rather than in brushstrokes. From Software placed these paintings in their locations deliberately, with care, so that the world and the art inside it match at perfect angles. Standing in that spot and feeling the correspondence between the painting and the landscape is a quiet, private experience. It is the kind of thing you cannot describe easily to someone else without it sounding trivial. But when you find it yourself, it feels like a secret passed between the world and you alone. The painting called Redmane is perhaps the clearest example. Its warm tones and crumbling stone archway can be matched precisely to a location in Caelid when approached from the correct elevation and bearing. The light behaves in the same way. The ruins fall at the same angle. Whoever placed that painting in the game knew exactly what they were doing, and they trusted that someone someday would take the time to find it. There is something unusual about the way status effects accumulate in Elden Ring that even dedicated players often misunderstand. Most players know that standing in poisonous swamps, being struck by certain enemies, or drinking from corrupted sources begins to fill a status meter. When that meter fills, the effect triggers. That much is understood. What very few realize is that certain status effects do not simply stack in a linear way. Some of them have hidden thresholds where the rate of accumulation changes depending on how many times you have already been afflicted during that game session. A character who has been poisoned 3 or 4 times in a short window will begin to accumulate the next poison instance more slowly than someone experiencing it for the first time. This is not a mechanic that is ever explained. It is not documented anywhere in the game's text. It exists quietly in the game's logic, a small act of mercy built into a game that is not usually known for mercy. This matters most in places like the Lake of Rot, where the scarlet rot accumulation is continuous and aggressive. Experienced players sometimes notice, without ever fully understanding why, that the rot feels slightly less punishing on subsequent visits compared to the first. That feeling is real. The system is working as designed. But because it has never surfaced, players tend to attribute it to getting better at managing exposure rather than recognizing the game itself is subtly adjusting behind the scenes. The creatures known as omens are scattered throughout the lands between in ways that carry more significance than most players ever investigate. They are large, horned humanoids, typically found in sewers or darkened ruins, regarded by most players as enemies to defeat and move past. But the item descriptions attached to omen-related gear tell a different story. Omens are not monsters. They are humans, born with horns, regarded by the societies of the lands between as cursed from birth and cast into the underground to live out their lives in darkness. The sewers of Lendel, the capital city, are filled with them. Those sewers run directly beneath the city where royalty once walked. The implication is not subtle once you see it. The most powerful civilization in the lands between built its grandeur directly above a hidden population it had condemned simply for the circumstances of their birth. The omen who rules the deepest portion of those sewers, the one most players encounter as a boss, is Mog in one of his earlier manifestations. But the omens surrounding him are not followers of chaos. They are simply people who had nowhere else to go. The sewers were not given to them. The sewers are where they were put, and they made of that darkness whatever life they could. There is a detail about the way Torrent, the spectral steed, behaves near certain locations that almost no player ever notices, because it requires standing still in a spot with no obvious reason to do so. Near the locations where the largest underground roots of the Erd tree break through the surface, places where the golden wood shows through the earth, a Torrent behaves differently than on open road. His idle animations shift. He paws at the earth more slowly. His breath, which is always visible as a soft shimmer in cold environments, seems to deepen. He does not react to enemies differently in these locations. He does not move faster or slower, but the subtle shift in his animations in those specific places suggests that Torrent himself holds some relationship to the Erd tree that goes beyond mere proximity. The lore around Torrent is deliberately incomplete. He is described as a creature of grace, connected in some unspoken way to the same force that granted the Tarnished their return to the lands between. But the nature of that connection is never made explicit. The behavioral change near Erdtree roots is not explained anywhere in the game's text. It is simply there, waiting for the player who stops riding long enough to notice that their horse is paying attention to something. There is a particular quality to the ambient sounds in the deepest sections of the underground lakes, specifically in the area surrounding the Lake of Rot, that reveals something about how sound was used in this world as a design tool. Most players move through these areas quickly because the scarlet rot accumulation makes lingering dangerous. But if you drain one of the partially accessible dry sections and simply stand there without moving, the ambient audio in that space shifts gradually. There is a low resonance that builds over time, almost below the threshold of perception at first, and it deepens into something that sounds faintly like breathing, slow, enormous, and incredibly patient. This is not a musical track. It is not tied to any event. It exists in the environment as a texture of sound, and it was placed there intentionally by composers who understood that the most unsettling thing you can do in a space where sight is limited is to fill the air with something that sounds alive. The composer for Elden Ring, Yuka Kitamura, has spoken in interviews about using sound as a form of environmental storytelling. The ambient design of underground spaces, in particular, was built to communicate something about the age and the weight of what exists below the surface of the lands between. That breathing resonance, heard by almost no one, is one of the most literal expressions of that philosophy in the entire game. There is a behavior tied to the fingers of the two fingers, those pale, gesturing limbs that deliver guidance to players who follow the path of the Erd Tree that goes far beyond their narrative function. Most players interact with these figures at the Roundtable hold and at certain sacred locations, receiving direction and cryptic counsel. What very few ever discover is that by performing specific gestures in front of the two fingers at the Roundtable hold, the fingers themselves respond, not with words, not with new dialogue. The fingers shift their position, subtly, slightly, as though acknowledging what they have witnessed. The gestures that trigger this response are not labeled or hinted at. They were found only through systematic experimentation by players who spent hours in the hold performing every gesture they possessed. The response, as when it comes, is small, a tilt, a slight adjustment in how the fingers hold themselves in the air. It is not accompanied by any reward or revelation, but it tells you that these figures, often dismissed as passive set dressing, were designed to be aware of their surroundings in a way that almost no one ever tests. The game did not need to include that. It added nothing to the player's progress. It was placed there purely as a secret for the attentive, a small acknowledgement hidden inside a figure most players pass without thought. The churches of the lands between are largely treated as convenient waypoints, places where sacred tears can be gathered, where Marika statues can be found, where a quiet save point offers a moment of stillness before pressing on. But each church, when examined carefully, has a specific architectural detail that marks it as belonging to a particular period in the history of the lands between. The style of the stonework, the shape of the windows, the angle of the spires, these are not random. Earlier churches, built before the Shattering, use a particular kind of carved detail along their doorframes that later ones do not. Churches constructed closer to the time of the Shattering have structural elements that suggest haste, corners less refined, stonework slightly uneven, as though whoever was building them knew time was short. This is architectural lore that the game never explains in text. No item description mentions the stylistic evolution of Marika's places of worship. But the details are consistent across every church in the game, which means the artists responsible for building these spaces were working from a shared historical understanding of what these places meant and when they were made. The history of the lands between is embedded in the grain of its stonework, and almost no one ever reads it. There is a mechanic related to the way enemies perceive sound in Elden Ring that goes far beyond the basics most players understand. Most know that sprinting near sleeping enemies can wake them, and that crouching reduces detection range. What almost no one has discovered is that certain surfaces transmit footstep sounds differently, and that enemies in adjacent areas can be alerted not by sight or proximity, but by the reverberant qualities of specific floor materials. Stone corridors behave differently from earthen floors. Water surfaces, even shallow ones, carry sound further. Wooden platforms, in certain fortresses, have a resonance that alerts enemies 2 rooms away when a sprinting player crosses them, enemies who would not otherwise have had any sensory contact with the player at all. This was documented by a small group of players who became obsessed with stealth rooting in specific legacy dungeons. They found, through patient trial and error, that routes that seemed safe were consistently breaking detection, not because of visual lines, but because of sound pathways built into the environment. The game does not explain this. There is no tooltip about surface acoustics. It simply exists as a layer of physical realism underneath a world that already asks a great deal of the players who love it. There is a set of gestures in Elden Ring that were not present in the game at launch and were added through updates, and among these are several whose origins connect them to completely different corners of From Software's history. Some of the later added gestures carry the precise animation timing and execution style of gestures from Dark Souls, not remade or approximated, but essentially identical in their motion. Whether this was a deliberate act of tribute or a practical reuse of animation data, the result is that players who have spent time across From Software's library sometimes feel an unexpected sense of recognition performing these gestures in the lands between. The animation language speaks across games. This has the effect of making the Tarnished feel, in a quiet and uncanny way, like a character who shares a history with other travelers from other worlds, a sense that the gesture they just performed has been performed before in other forgotten kingdoms by other forgotten people. It is the kind of continuity that rewards players not just for their time with Elden Ring, but for their time with the whole of From Software's work. The game does not need to call attention to this. It trusts that the people who will notice already know. There is a mechanic that most players discover by accident and then promptly forget, and it involves the way that equipment load affects not just movement speed, but the behavior of certain environmental interactions. Players with very low equipment load, those building toward the light roll threshold, have a slightly extended duration on certain ledge grab animations, meaning they can successfully cross some environmental gaps that medium load or heavy load builds cannot. This was not in any official documentation at launch. It emerged through community testing when players noticed that light build characters seemed to have a greater success rate on certain jumps and traversal points that felt inconsistent at first glance. The implication is that the physicality of the Tarnished is not purely cosmetic, that the weight they carry affects how their body moves through the world in ways that extend beyond combat to basic environmental navigation. A character carrying almost nothing moves through the lands between differently than a knight in full armor, and not just in how fast they walk. The world responds to what you carry. Most players never notice because most players find an equipment load they are comfortable with and stop experimenting. But those who do experiment find a game that has modeled physical weight with more care than almost anyone suspected. The Crucible Knights that appear throughout the lands between are among the most lore-dense enemies in the game, and most players engage with them purely as a mechanical challenge, patient, punishing, requiring deliberate timing to defeat. What almost no one investigates is the variation between individual Crucible Knights in terms of the specific animal features their armor incorporates. The Crucible of Life, in Elden Ring's lore, was the primordial state of the world before order was imposed upon it, a state in which all life was mixed, fluid, so capable of expressing almost any physical form. The Crucible Knights are warriors who trained themselves to access residual traces of that ancient life state, expressing it through aspects of animal physicality. But the specific animals expressed differ from knight to knight, and the differences are not random. Crucible Knights, found in locations tied to the grace of the Erd Tree, tend to express features associated with creatures of light and sky. Those found in places of deeper shadow or underground express features associated with creatures of earth and water. The game is building a taxonomy of primordial life through the designs of its armor sets, and that taxonomy maps onto the geography of the world in ways that make the Crucible feel like a real cosmological system rather than a convenient name for a class of enemy. There is a behavior exhibited by a specific type of environmental enemy, the large, slow-moving clay golems found in the Altus Plateau in Landel, that goes entirely unnoticed by most players, because it only triggers after the golem has been standing completely undisturbed for several minutes of real time. If a player approaches one of these golems without triggering its combat detection, hides nearby, and then waits without interacting, the golem eventually performs a series of gestures that are not part of its combat or idle animation cycle. These gestures are slow, deliberate, and faintly suggest something between worship and maintenance. The golem raising its hands, lowering them, turning slowly in place. Whether this is a guardian ritual, a maintenance cycle, or something that carries narrative meaning is unclear. It is simply there for those patient enough to witness it. The golems in the lands between were built as instruments of protection. Their item descriptions connect them to an age of order, when such constructs were reliable expressions of institutional power. The behavior witnessed during those long, undisturbed moments reads less like a machine running a program and more like a creature that has been doing the same thing alone for so long that it has developed something that looks indistinguishable from habit. Whether that distinction matters in a world as broken as the lands between is a question the game does not answer. There is a visual detail embedded in the character creation screen that most players see once, briefly, before committing to a build and never visiting again. But in the lighting of that character creator, specifically the light source positioned to the upper left of the screen, the shadows that fall across your character's face behave differently depending on which starting class you select before customizing. The proportional geometry of each base model is slightly different, and the way that single light source interacts with those geometric differences creates subtly distinct shadow patterns. Vagabond faces in that lighting have a particular quality. Astrologer faces have a different one. These are not differences in the slider values, which the player controls. They are differences in the base models themselves, physical differences that the lighting of the creation screen reveals to anyone patient enough to cycle through all 10 classes without touching a single slider. This is a very small thing. It makes no difference to how the game plays, but it tells you something about the degree of care put into the construction of these character models. That each one was built as a distinct physical person with a distinct history written into their proportions, and that even in the stillness of a menu screen, the world they come from is doing its quiet work. There is a hidden layer to the Ranni questline that goes beyond the path most players follow even when they complete it fully. Ranni's questline is already the longest and most involved in the game, touching on the stars, the age of the moon, the betrayal of the two fingers, and a vision of order fundamentally different from the one the Erdtree offers. Players who complete it receive what is arguably the most contemplative ending in the game. But within the quest line, there are NPC interactions that change based on the order in which the player chooses to complete certain steps, not different rewards, not different locked paths, but different dialogue. Blood speaks differently depending on whether you have spoken to certain other characters before coming to him. Saluvis reveals certain observations about Ranni that he withholds if the player approaches him in the more common sequence. These variations are extraordinarily difficult to discover organically because completing the questline naturally tends to push players forward in a fairly linear order. The dialogue variants exist for players who resist that forward momentum, who go sideways, circle back, speak again to figures they have already spoken with. The questline does not reward this with unique items or endings. It rewards it with perspective. Characters in the Ranni questline are aware of each other in ways that become visible only when you move through that awareness deliberately, catching it from different angles. There is an almost entirely unknown mechanic associated with the bell bearings that players collect and deliver to the Twin Maiden husks at the Roundtable hold. Most players know that bell bearings expand the purchasing options of those merchants, allowing them to sell items previously available only from specific vendors who may have died or whose locations have been passed. What almost no player investigates is what happens if you deliver a bell bearing and then return to the location where the merchant who owned that bell bearing once stood. In several cases, not all, but several, a change has occurred in that space. A piece of environmental detail has shifted. Something in the arrangement of objects in that spot is different from how it was before the bearing was collected. The change is not dramatic. It does not announce itself, but it is consistent, reproducible, and deliberate. The bell bearing system on its surface is a quality of life mechanic, a way of keeping commerce available even as the world's population dwindles. But underneath that utility is something more melancholy. The idea that when you take what a merchant carried to the hub of the world, the place they occupied becomes somehow less. The world notices the absence even when the player does not. There is a specific time of in-game cycle, not tied to real-world time, but to the in-game day-night system, during which the color of the sky above the Liurnia of the lakes changes in a way that almost no player ever sees, because very few remain idle long enough to witness the full transition. At the deepest point of the in-game night, just before the system begins cycling back toward dawn, the sky above Liurnia passes through a color that does not appear at any other time, a blue so deep it sits at the edge of purple, present for only a few in-game minutes before it begins to lighten again. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, viewed from the eastern shore of the lake during this window, looks entirely different from how it appears at any other time. The glintstone lights at its upper towers, which glow faintly in the daytime and with ordinary bluish warmth at night, take on a different cast in that specific deep night color, something that reads almost violet, almost cold, almost threatening. No quest sends you to the eastern shore of Liurnia at deep night. No item description tells you the Academy looks different depending on when you observe it. The sky simply does what it does, and if you happen to be there watching, you see something that most players do not. There is a set of armor pieces in Elden Ring whose item descriptions reference specific minor historical events that are not mentioned anywhere else in the game, events that would have preceded the shattering by what the lore implies were centuries. Most players read item descriptions once, absorb the most relevant detail, and move on. But certain pieces of armor, when their descriptions are read with full attention, describe moments in the political history of the lands between that have no counterpart in any other text in the game. They are like footnotes to a history that was never written, references to battles, to treaties, to individual acts of loyalty or betrayal that left their traces only in the design of a piece of metal worn by someone now long dead. The pauldrons of a particular set of Lanedale Knight armor describe a specific day when a unit of warriors held a breach in the capital's outer wall against an assault that would otherwise have destroyed the city. The description does not name the battle. It does not give a year. It simply says that the pauldrons were worn by the soldiers of that breach, and that the style of their construction was changed afterward as a mark of recognition. No other source in the game mentions this event. It exists in a single item description, preserved only because someone decided a set of shoulders deserved a history. There is a behavior connected to the Celestial Dew, one of the rarer consumable items in the game, that most players use only for its intended mechanical purpose, restoring NPC friendliness after hostile actions, and almost no one investigates beyond that. But if you use a Celestial Dew at a site of grace that is located indoors, inside a building, a cave, or an underground space, the animation the tarnished performs during the use is slightly different from the animation performed when using it outdoors. The gesture is the same in structure, but the body language is subtler, more contained, as though the act of appealing to the Erd tree's mercy is modulated by whether or not the sky is visible. Outdoors, there's an upward quality to the gesture, an openness to it. Inside, it turns inward. This is an animation detail so small that it would be invisible to a player watching in the middle of a session while also managing inventory and planning their next move. It is only visible to someone who has stopped, who has taken note of it, who has specifically thought to compare the two contexts. It is exactly the kind of thing that would never be noticed by accident, and exactly the kind of thing that From Software placed in the game on purpose. There is a mechanic embedded in the system governing sorceries that most players who dedicate themselves to magic builds never encounter, because it requires a very specific combination of conditions that ordinary play does not tend to create. When a sorcery is cast that requires holding the cast button to charge full moon sorceries, certain Loretta spells, the charge animation has a secondary stage that most players never reach because they release the button before it occurs. If the button is held past the point where the spell is visually fully charged, past the moment most players release, a second transformation occurs in the casting animation. The staff or seal completes a motion. The glintstone embedded in the catalyst pulses differently. And in some charged sorceries, the projectile that results from that maximum charge is measurably different in behavior from the standard full charge release, not dramatically, but observably. No tutorial mentions this. No item description references it. It was found by players who held buttons longer than seemed necessary and noticed something change. The possibility of a second threshold inside what was already considered maximum charge is the kind of mechanical secret that says more about the game's depth than any single mechanic. It is a system designed by people who trusted that someone would push further than seemed reasonable and wanted to reward them when they did. There is a location in Landel, royal capital, that most players pass through quickly because it sits between two more prominent areas and contains no boss, no merchant, and no obvious major loot. It is a stretch of broken avenue flanked by collapsed buildings, with the enormous coiled dragon fortresses half visible beyond the rooftops. In this specific stretch of avenue, if you look at the architecture carefully, you can identify the remains of what were once civilian structures, homes, small shops, the kind of buildings that populated a capital city before it was remade into a place of pure, divine aspiration. They are buried under layers of later construction. They have been built over, walled through, incorporated into larger ceremonial structures without acknowledgement, but their original forms are still readable in the bones of the buildings if you know what you are looking at. The people who lived in those original structures are long gone, and nothing in the game's text refers to them. No one remembers the Landel that existed before the Erd tree's golden light made it into something sacred and inhuman. The city, as players experience it, is the final layer, the one built on top of all the others. But the others are there, quiet and compressed, in the architecture of walls that were once something else. There is something about the way the finger ruins, those shattered, enormous finger-shaped stone structures scattered across the far reaches of the lands between and its underground, are positioned relative to each other that rewards cartographic attention. If you mark their locations on the game's map, the pattern of their placement is not random. The structures are positioned at intervals that suggest a geometric system, the kind of spatial organization that implies they were once part of a coherent whole, a structure or array so large that its individual parts are now separated by entire regions of the world. What that structure was, or what purpose it served is not explained anywhere in the game, but the geometry speaks for itself. This is the kind of secret that requires a player to step back from the ground level experience of the game entirely, to look at the map as a map rather than as a navigation tool, and to think about what the placement of things across that map might mean. Very few players ever do this. Most players experience the map as a practical object. The Finger Ruins, seen from that practical perspective, are just strange structures with interesting item drops. Seen from further back, they are the remnants of something that once encompassed the entire known world. There is a sound that plays when the player character dies, and the rune's lost message appears on screen that most players hear hundreds of times without ever consciously isolating it from the surrounding audio. It is a specific tone, not the death music, which most players know well, not the sound of the character's equipment hitting the ground. It is a tone that plays for less than a second, layered under the other sounds, heard only if the surrounding audio drops low enough and the player is paying close attention. This tone is the same tone in a lower register that plays during the moment of character creation when you finalize your appearance and your character opens their eyes for the first time. The implication is quiet and devastating. The sound that marks the beginning of your character's existence in the lands between, and the sound that marks each ending of that existence are the same sound played at different distances. Life and death in the lands between share a frequency. Whether that was an intentional compositional decision or a discovered correspondence, it is there to be heard by anyone who slows down enough to listen for it. There is a specific configuration of statues inside the Erdtree Sanctuary, the golden space you pass through just before reaching Malekith in his first form, that most players barely glance at during the sprint to reach the boss fog gate. The statues in this space are posed. Each one is positioned with intention, and their poses taken together tell a sequential story. They depict a series of figures in the act of offering something upward. Some hold objects aloft, some reach with empty hands. One, in the corner furthest from the entrance, is turned away from the others entirely, facing the wall. No item description refers to these statues. No NPC mentions them. But their arrangement is not decorative. The figure turned away is facing the direction of the Forbidden Lands, the path that leads away from the Erdtree toward the mountaintops where other kinds of truth are kept. Whether this was placed deliberately to suggest someone in the history of the Erdtree's worship who turned their face from it, or whether it is simply a spatial accommodation to the architecture, the result is a statue that breaks the composition of a space designed around reverence. In a room full of figures making offerings, one is not. Most players never look at it. There is a dynamic between certain paired bosses in Elden Ring that goes beyond the obvious mechanical challenge of fighting two enemies simultaneously. The Godskin duo, encountered in crumbling Farum Azula, is the most cited example, but the less examined case is the relationship between the two versions of the encounter and how the apostle and the noble each behave when the other dies. Most players focus on the resurrection mechanic, the fact that one can revive the other, as the dominant feature of that fight. But in the period between one going down and the other beginning to revive, the surviving enemy's behavior changes in ways that are subtle enough that most players in combat do not register them. The noble, when fighting alone after the apostle has fallen, becomes noticeably more aggressive in its attacks for a brief window. The apostle, when fighting alone after the noble has fallen, pauses for a fraction of a second longer between certain attacks than it does when the noble is present. These behavioral shifts suggest that the two are not simply two separate enemies placed in the same room, but were designed with some awareness of each other built into their logic. They fight differently when together, and differently still when separated, and the differences, while small, imply a kind of codependence that makes the fight feel less like an encounter with monsters and more like an encounter with something that has history. There is a particular item in Elden Ring, found in one of the game's more obscure locations, that most players never read the description of because by the time they acquire it, inventory management has usually become a practical rather than contemplative exercise. It is a type of consumable perfume, one of several that exist in the game and are primarily used for their brief stat modifiers. Most players, finding another perfume bottle, absorb the effect and file it away. But the description of this specific one does not describe its mechanical effect in the usual terms. Instead, it describes the scent. It says the perfume smells of rain on stone in a place where it has not rained for a very long time. A description that is simultaneously precise and impossible to verify, referring to a sensory experience of a place that exists only in the lore. The lands between, in Elden Ring's world, has not had ordinary rainfall for longer than most inhabitants remember. The weather of that world has been shaped by divine interference and the consequences of the shattering. An item that describes a scent of rain on stone, rain that no one alive would recognize, is describing something that was preserved in a bottle from an era that is otherwise completely inaccessible. The past in the lands between does not leave many traces. That perfume is one of them, and almost no one reads what it is. There is something built into the way the night sky above the lands between behaves that rewards players who stop to look up rather than forward. The stars visible from different regions of the game are not the same stars. The constellations visible from Caelid differ from those visible from Liurnia, which differ again from those visible atop the mountaintops of the giants. This is geographically realistic. Different latitudes offer different views of the sky, but it also carries lore significance. Certain constellations, visible only from specific regions, appear in item descriptions connected to those regions. The stars that Ranni seeks, described as the dark paths between fixed lights, are not visible from anywhere in the lands between that the player can reach. They are referenced in text, but absent from the visible sky. This means the game built a sky that is simultaneously beautiful, geographically coherent, and narratively incomplete. The stars Ranni is looking for are somewhere beyond the visible world. The sky above the lands between is not the whole sky. There is more, and the game knows it, and it placed that knowledge in the stars it withheld. There is a category of environmental storytelling in Elden Ring that uses the placement of crafting materials to imply ecological relationships that are never stated in text. Wherever a specific type of flower grows, you can find, within a certain radius, the creatures that feed on it. Wherever those creatures gather, you find the larger predators that hunt them. This is consistent across the entire lands between. The ecosystem implied by item spawn locations is internally coherent in a way that suggests someone designed not just where items would be useful to find, but where they would naturally exist. The food web of the lands between is written in geography, and almost no player ever reads it as such. The consequence of this design is that the world does not feel like a collection of hand-placed rewards. It feels like a place that had a life before players arrived, a place where things grew and fed and hunted according to their own logic, and whose disruption by the shattering is legible in the places where that logic breaks down. In Caelid, the ecology is wrong. Things that should not be there are there, and things that should be there are gone. The scarlet rot did not just change the color of the water and the sky. It broke a system, and the system's absence is visible in where crafting materials do and do not appear. There is an aspect of the Roundtable Hold's architecture that receives almost no discussion despite the fact that it is among the more mysterious features of that space. The hold appears to exist outside the normal geography of the lands between. Players are transported there through the guidance of grace, not through any passage that could be mapped. But the windows of the Roundtable hold look out onto a view, a foggy, indistinct exterior that seems to suggest a real outside. And what is visible through those windows does not match any location accessible in the game. The sky through the windows has a color that appears during no observable time of day at any real location. The architecture partially visible beyond the glass is of a style that does not appear anywhere in the accessible world. This is either a sky that belongs to a different era, the hold existing temporally out of step with the lands between, anchored in a moment that no longer corresponds to the present, or it is a location that was never given coordinates in the game's world. The hold is described as a place gathered to by the tarnished because of Grace's guidance, which implies it was not built by human hands, but was recognized rather than constructed. What it was before it was a gathering place, and what exists outside its windows are questions the game poses only by not answering them. The way in which the Tarnished is described by other NPCs changes significantly across the course of the game in ways that most players do not track because the changes are gradual and depend on which NPCs are still alive. At the start, characters who speak to you do so with wariness and sometimes contempt. The Tarnished are a known category, returned after long absence, not universally welcomed. But as quests advance and relationships deepen, the language shifts. Characters begin describing the Tarnished not in categorical terms, not as one of the returned, but in individual terms. They use your actions, not your classification, as the basis for what they say about you. What almost no player notices is that this shift in language does not occur evenly across all NPCs. Some characters continue to speak in categorical terms, no matter what you do, treating the Tarnished as a type rather than a person. These are usually figures with deep institutional affiliations, those whose identity is so bound to a system of order that they cannot accommodate individual exceptions. The ones who begin to speak differently are those who have already been separated from institution by grief or circumstance. The world of the lands between does not learn to see the Tarnished as an individual. Certain people in it do. The rest never will. There is something hidden in the item description of the Elden Ring itself, the artifact that gives the game its name, that players who reach the game's final moments can read, but very few ever do with full attention because the final boss sequence does not pause for contemplation. The description does not describe what the ring is. It describes what it was. The past tense used in its text is not an accident. The Elden Ring as an object is described in terms of what it once governed, the laws of the world, the order of life and death, the boundaries between states of existence, all of which are now broken. The description is a record of function that no longer fully applies. Reading the item description of the Elden Ring at the game's end while standing in the ruins of the Erd Tree's inner sanctum is one of the quietest experiences the game offers. The object you hold is the center of everything that has happened, every ruin, every silence, every NPC who looked at you with grief in their eyes. And its description is written in the past tense. It does not tell you what the ring will be when you restore it. It tells you what the ring was before everything fell apart. The future is not written there. It is left to you, and the description ends accordingly. There is a final detail that wraps around everything else, something so omnipresent in the experience of playing Elden Ring that its significance is easy to miss. Every sight of grace in the game emits a beam of golden light upward into the sky, upward toward the Erd Tree, toward the source of its power. This is visible and understood by most players. What is less understood is that these beams are not uniform. Their brightness varies, their width varies. Sites of grace in locations with deeper historical or spiritual significance emit brighter and wider beams than those in ordinary locations. The grace at the foot of the Erd Tree itself is nearly blinding compared to a grace at the edge of a minor ruin. No one tells you this. No mechanic depends on it. You could play through the entire game without ever noticing that the light at each grace site is trying to tell you something about the place you have found. But if you look, it is there. A system of light communicating a silent hierarchy, bright where the world was once most whole, dim where it has been most forgotten. The lands between is still trying to guide you, even now, even broken, even in ways that require you to stop moving and simply observe. The grace has not abandoned the world. It is just speaking more quietly than it once did. There is something to be said about the practice of paying attention, about moving through a world slowly enough to see it rather than just survive it. Elden Ring was built for both kinds of players. It punishes inattention in combat and rewards it in exploration, in lore, in the quiet details that accumulate into something larger than any single secret. The 1% of players who find these things are not necessarily the most skilled. They are often simply the most patient, the ones who looked up, who read again, who stayed an extra moment in a place that offered no obvious reason to stay. The lands between is not finished revealing itself. New players still arrive and walk those paths for the first time, and among them are always a few who will stop where the road curves and look out at the horizon and notice something that everyone before them walked past. That is what this world was built for. Not completion, not conquest. Discovery, quiet and ongoing in a world too large and too strange to ever be fully known. The fire here burns slowly. The world outside these words is patient, and whatever you take with you from the lands between tonight, carry it gently, because it was made with more care than most people ever get to notice. If you would like to carry more of these quiet journeys with you, consider subscribing and let the grace carry you forward. There is a peculiarity in how the game handles death replays, the ghostly recordings of other players' deaths that appear as faint spectral figures collapsing at various points across the lands between. Most players observe these out of curiosity or mild amusement, watching a ghostly tarnished stumble and fall at a ledge or collapse in a doorway. But there is a behavior within these ghosts that almost no one investigates. They do not always die in the same way. If you watch a death ghost at the same location across multiple visits, standing at the same spot, allowing multiple ghosts to cycle through, you will observe that the cause of death encoded in the animation differs from ghost to ghost. Some fall, some are struck, some simply collapse from accumulated damage or status effect. The variety is too great to be random. It suggests the ghost system is pulling from a deep and varied pool of recorded moments, and that the location of a ghost, not just its existence but its specific death, is communicating something about how dangerous that spot is, and in how many different ways. The players who tested this most thoroughly found specific locations where a disproportionate number of ghosts died facing a particular direction, suggesting that enemies in that space had a habitual attack pattern that most players never recognized while fighting through it. The ghosts, read collectively, are something close to a map of common mistakes, not written in text, but written in the aggregate behavior of thousands of dead strangers. It is one of the quietest pieces of multiplayer communication in any game. There is a quality to the blood that appears on the tarnished and on enemies after combat that most players see without registering as meaningful. The blood accumulation system in Elden Ring tracks not just damage but the type and source of damage, and the visual result of that tracking differs accordingly. Wounds from slashing weapons present differently on the surface of armor than wounds from blunt weapons. Blood from fire-enhanced weapons has a slightly different behavioral pattern after it appears than blood from standard physical hits. This is not always visible at standard play distance, but slowing the camera and observing closely in the aftermath of different combat types reveals that the game's damage presentation was built with more granularity than any functional purpose required. There is no gameplay benefit to this. Blood appearing correctly on the surface of armor does not change what the armor does, but it means that when you fight, the world you are fighting in is recording what happened with a level of physical specificity usually reserved for much smaller, more intimately scaled games. The Tarnished does not just take damage in Elden Ring. They bear the marks of specific events, and those marks are different depending on what the events were. There is an NPC that appears only under conditions so specific that many players who have completed the game multiple times have never encountered her. She is a small figure seated at the base of a particular Erdtree branch in the Altus Plateau, not near any site of grace, not along any obvious path. She is reachable only if you approach from a direction that requires crossing terrain the game never explicitly encourages you to cross. She sells one item, speaks 2 lines of dialogue, and does not appear in any quest. She has a name that is readable on her vendor screen but never spoken aloud. Her second line of dialogue, if you visit her twice, is different from her first, not dramatically, but differently phrased in a way that suggests she noticed you returning. She does not give you anything other than the item she sells. She does not react to your equipment or your quest progress, but she says in her second line of dialogue something that lands softly in the quiet of that location, that she has been sitting there for longer than she can account for, and that the branch above her has never changed, and that she finds that reassuring. It is 2 sentences from an NPC with almost no function. In a game full of tragedy, it is one of the few moments of something that approaches contentment, and it is hidden in a place that almost no one has ever been. There is a specific relationship between the placement of scarab enemies, those golden or silver rolling beetles found throughout the world, and the locations of graces that are often missed by players focused on reaching the next landmark. The scarabs always move. They always flee. Most players chase them down to collect the ashes of war or materials they drop, and then forget where they were. But the paths that scarabs travel before they are caught are not random. They travel consistently between 2 points, a location of historical significance and a site of grace. The scarab is, in a sense, following the same thing the player follows, moving between something old and something that still holds warmth. This is consistent enough across dozens of scarab locations to be a rule, not a coincidence. This means the scarab can be used as a kind of dowsing tool. If you follow a scarab without catching it and observe where it is heading, it will sometimes lead you toward a grace you have not yet found, or toward a location that contains something worth examining. The game does not tell you this. The scarab does not acknowledge its role. It simply runs the path it always runs, and whether you catch it or follow it is entirely your choice. There is a mechanic in the way the map works that goes largely unexamined because most players use the map as a navigation tool and not as an object of scrutiny. The elevation represented on the map, the lighter and darker shading used to suggest terrain height, is more precise than it appears. If you study the elevation representation carefully in areas you have explored thoroughly, you will find that cliffs and drops are represented with a specificity that allows you to predict, before visiting, whether a given slope is traversable on foot or requires torrent. The shading gradient encodes not just general topography, but specific traversability. Players who learn to read it can effectively pre-plan routes through unfamiliar terrain anticipating switchbacks and vertical passages that would otherwise be discovered only through trial and error. This requires a different relationship with the map than most players develop. It requires looking at it not as a set of icons and names, but as a topographic document, reading the texture of it rather than scanning for markers. The players who develop this skill move through the lands between differently. They arrive at places with a pre-existing mental model of the terrain that makes exploration feel less like discovery and more like confirmation. The map gives you more than directions. It gives you the shape of the world for those patient enough to read it. There is a sound design choice embedded in the combat music of certain boss encounters that goes entirely unperceived by most players because it operates at a frequency range that is felt as much as heard. The lowest register of the combat theme in the Star Scourge Radon fight contains a tone that pulses in rough correspondence with a slow heartbeat, slower than the player's own likely elevated heart rate during an intense boss fight, slower than the tempo of the music itself. It sits beneath the melodic content of the track, beneath even the percussion, as a kind of subterranean pulse that the body registers without the conscious mind identifying it. The effect, when it works, is subtle dissonance. Your body is beating faster than the thing beneath you is beating, and that disparity communicates something about scale and age that the music's more obvious elements cannot carry alone. Radon is ancient. The force he is containing is older than him. The heartbeat under the music is not his. It is the pull of the stars he holds at bay, patient and enormous and waiting. Almost no one hears it, but almost everyone who fights Radon for the first time describes feeling something massive about that encounter that they cannot attribute to any specific element. That pulse is part of it. There is a behavior in how the game loads environmental lighting that reveals something about the time an area was designed to be experienced. Certain zones in Elden Ring have lighting that shifts throughout the game's day-night cycle, but has one specific time at which all environmental elements, the shadows, the ambient glow, the fog, the color temperature of the sky, align in a way that makes the zone look exactly as it appears in official promotional artwork. The specific time at which this alignment occurs is different for each zone, and the alignment lasts only a short window before the light continues cycling. This means that for each zone, there is a correct time to be there, not mechanically correct, but aesthetically correct, the moment the artist had in mind when they composed the visual identity of that region. Liurnia of the Lakes in the promotional materials has a particular quality of dim, pearl gray sky with the academy lit from below. That quality is achievable in-game, but only at the right moment of the cycle. Kaelid's promotional imagery has a specific character of ochre and bloody shadow that appears briefly around the equivalent of late afternoon in the game's time system. These windows exist, and inside them, the game looks exactly as the artist who made it imagined it should look. There is an aspect of the market fight, usually one of the first major boss encounters players face, and therefore one of the most discussed, that almost no player observes because the conversation around that fight has been so thoroughly dominated by strategy and difficulty. Margit's dialogue during the fight changes in ways that most players do not notice because they are focused on survival. His early taunts are contemptuous, the tarnished as an insect, as something beneath consideration. But as the fight progresses and the player demonstrates resilience, the language shifts. The contempt begins to carry something underneath it. The insults become slightly more specific, slightly more attentive, as though Margit is actually watching now, adjusting what he says to what he is seeing. By the time the fight reaches its second phase, Margit is no longer speaking generically. He is addressing this specific tarnished, this one here now, in a way that his opening lines did not. The trajectory of his dialogue is one of grudging recognition. He does not like you anymore by the end, but he sees you And the dialogue he speaks in those final moments of the fight is the dialogue of someone who has been surprised, which is a different thing entirely from the dialogue of someone who expected to be unimpressed and was. There is a set of visual cues in the design of enemy armor and weaponry that encodes faction affiliation at a level of detail no combat encounter actually requires you to read. The soldiers of different Landell factions, those aligned with different noble houses, and those serving different divine obligations, have distinguishing marks on their armor that are only visible on close inspection when combat has paused. The engravings differ. The specific styling of pauldrons and greaves differs. The ceremonial elements added to otherwise functional armor differ. These differences encode history. Which faction was older, which was granted higher status, which was formed under duress, and never quite achieved full legitimacy. Most players perceive Lindell's soldiers as a homogeneous mass of difficult enemies, but they were designed as distinct social groups with distinct histories, and the armor they wear carries that distinction. It is history worn on the body, made visible for anyone with the interest and the stillness to observe it. There is a particular item set, the fingerprint armor set, that carries in its item descriptions a complete account of a single individual who is never named anywhere else in the game and who has no presence in any quest, cutscene, or end-piece dialogue. The descriptions tell the story of a person who chose, voluntarily, to accept the fingerprint, the mark of servitude associated with Moog and the outer god he served, not out of devotion, but out of pragmatism. They believed the mark would give them access to power that would allow them to protect something they loved. The descriptions do not tell you whether they succeeded. They tell you what they chose and why they chose it, and that the armor was all that remained. This person exists only in 4 item descriptions. They have no name, no face, no voice. They made a choice in a world full of impossible choices, for reasons that read as recognizable even to a player who has never inhabited that world. The armor is their monument, and the monument was placed in the game in a location most players sprint past without stopping to loot. Their story is available to anyone. Almost no one has read it. There is a detail in the environmental construction of the deep-root depths, the vast, root-tangled underground space beneath Landell, that carries more narrative significance than its surface appearance suggests. The deep-root depths contain ruins. Most underground areas in Elden Ring contain ruins, so this observation seems unremarkable. But the specific character of the ruins in the deep-root depths is different from ruins found elsewhere. They are not the ruins of fortresses or temples. They are the ruins of dwellings, small, domestic structures, the kind that would have housed ordinary people. These dwellings predate the Erd tree's roots, having reached them. They were here before the roots grew through them. What this means, the deep-root depths were not always deep. They were once at a level of the world where people lived ordinary lives in ordinary houses, and the growth of the Erd tree's roots gradually enclosed them, pushed them deeper, submerged an inhabited space under the earth until it became the lightless cavity it is now. The people who lived there are gone. No one speaks about them. The evidence of them exists only in the specific architecture of the ruins, domestic rather than monumental, private rather than public, and in the way the roots have grown through and around those structures, as though indifferent to what they were before they became infrastructure. There is a mechanic built into the game's Spirit Ash summoning system that most players never encounter because it requires a very specific sequence of actions during a boss fight that ordinary play does not tend to produce. When a Spirit Ash summon is active and the player dies during a boss fight, the Spirit Ash, which normally vanishes with the player's death, does something before it disappears. In certain boss arenas, the Ash performs a final action. This action is not the same for all Ashes. Some perform the last animation in their attack sequence, some return to their summoning position. One specific ash, the Lone Wolf Ashes, moves to the player's death location and pauses there briefly before fading. This behavior suggests that the spirit ashes were designed with a layer of responsiveness that most players never trigger because most boss deaths are followed immediately by the desire to try again, not by observation of what the just dismissed summon is doing. The ashes behave differently in the aftermath of failure than they do during active combat, and that behavior carries implications about what they are. Not just tools deployed by the player, but presences that register the events around them in ways the game chose not to make obvious. There is a location in Stormvale Castle that most players move through so quickly and under such heavy combat pressure that almost none of them ever stop to look at what is on the walls. Stormvale is usually experienced as a gauntlet, one of the game's earliest legacy dungeons, dense with enemies, full of ambushes, navigated mostly in a state of defensive urgency. But along several of its interior corridors, the walls bear murals. These murals are faded, aged into near invisibility in some sections, but in certain areas with better ambient lighting, they are legible. They depict scenes from before the castle was a fortress, from a period when the structure served a different function, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps administrative. The figures in the murals are not engaged in combat. They are engaged in transactions, goods being exchanged, agreements being formalized, delegations being received. Stormvale Castle was once a place where the business of governance was conducted in peace, and the murals remember that. The castle the player fights through is a militarized ruin built over a foundation that was once something else. Most players never stop to see it. The enemies in those corridors ensure that most players never will. There is an observable behavioral difference in how the game handles the Tarnished's footstep sounds when they are wearing no armor, the completely unequipped state, compared to when they are wearing even the lightest available gear. The sound design for barefoot traversal across different surface types is distinct and was recorded separately from shod traversal. Grass, stone, water, and wooden surfaces all have unique barefoot audio that does not appear under any other equipment configuration. This level of audio granularity for a gameplay state that offers no mechanical advantage and that very few players ever choose to inhabit is, on its face, an act of pure creative dedication. There is no reason to have recorded barefoot audio for all surface types. No one expected it. No review criticized its absence before it was discovered. It exists because someone working on the sound design of Elden Ring thought that the game should sound right, even in the states most players would never hear, and they made it right anyway. That is the kind of decision that goes entirely unnoticed, and that is, for exactly that reason, the truest expression of what making this game meant to the people who made it. There is a visual quality to the light that falls through the broken roof of the Cathedral of Dragon Communion, the crimson, ruined structure in southern Caelid where dragon incantations can be learned, that changes depending on the weather system active in that region when you visit. The Caelid weather system cycles through a series of states, most of which are variations on the oppressive ochre haze that defines the region's character. But during the brief transitions between weather states, a different quality of light enters the cathedral through its open ceiling. For a short window, the light that falls through the break in the stone is softer, less filtered by the scarlet rot's influence on the atmosphere, and in that light, the interior of the cathedral reads differently. The stained elements of the architecture, which normally seem suffused with corruption, briefly show their original colors. The Cathedral of Dragon Communion was not always in Caelid. The implication of its architecture and its distance from the center of the rot suggests it was constructed in a different time, in a different place, and that the expansion of the rot eventually reached it and enclosed it. The light that enters it during those transitional weather moments is a glimpse of what it once looked like, the cathedral in its original context, for the seconds before the haze settles back in. There is something in the ecology of the underground, specifically in the Einsel River and Noxtella, Eternal City, that rewards the player who moves slowly and stops in open spaces to observe what is happening around them. These underground cities were built by the new men, the people who preceded the current inhabitants of the lands between, and they were built with an attention to living systems that the surface world has largely lost. In these spaces, if you stand quietly, you can observe cycles of behavior in the non-aggressive creatures that inhabit them. Small creatures move between specific locations on patterns that repeat. Certain luminescent organisms pulse in response to the movement of others nearby. The ecosystem of these underground spaces was designed to be alive even when the player is not actively engaging with it. The eternal cities are called eternal not because they cannot end, the evidence of their partial ruin is everywhere, but because they were built with the aspiration of creating something that would endure. Part of that aspiration was a living world inside an artificial one, underground rivers, bioluminescent ecosystems, a city that contained its own version of the sky in the form of ceiling mosaics depicting constellations. Standing in those spaces and watching the small creatures move through their patterns, you are inside someone's dream of permanence. The dream survived in pieces even after everything else broke. There is a final layer to the Elden Ring experience that wraps around all of these secrets, a layer that's not a secret at all, but that most players never articulate even to themselves. The game is not primarily about combat. Combat is its most prominent surface, the thing that demands attention, that teaches players the fastest, that creates the most shareable moments. But underneath the combat is a world built with the assumption that some players will stop fighting entirely and simply exist in it for a while. The sites of grace are rest points, not just save points. The ambient music that plays at each one was scored differently from the combat music, slower, more sustained, designed for extended listening. The landscapes visible from high points were constructed not just as backdrops, but as subjects, things worth looking at for their own sake. The secrets in this game are not hidden behind locked doors or earned through skill checks. They are hidden behind the willingness to be present, to put down the urgency of forward progress and pay attention to what the world is doing while you stand in it. Elden Ring is, beneath everything, a meditation on attention. The world it offers to players who are fully present is layered, strange, and extraordinarily rich. The world it offers to players who are moving through it quickly is also remarkable, but only one of those worlds contains everything. There is a phenomenon in the way that remembrances function, those items dropped by the game's major bosses that can be traded for powerful weapons or spells, that goes beyond their mechanical purpose and into something closer to philosophy. Most players cash in remembrances quickly, either exchanging them for the strongest reward available or holding them in inventory until a decision feels right. But the descriptions of the remembrances are written differently from the descriptions of other items. Most item descriptions describe the item itself. Remembrance descriptions describe an experience. They describe the sensation of holding within yourself the compressed existence of a being that once moved through the world as a god or a general or a blood-soaked sovereign, and they do so in language that is first-person adjacent, language that implies the reader is the one holding that weight. This is a deliberate choice in how the text was written. The remembrance of Star Scourge Radon does not describe Radon. It describes what it feels like to carry Radon, to hold the concentrated essence of someone who kept the stars from moving, who fought until cognition left him, and whose final act of purpose was continued even without a mind to guide it. Reading that description in full alone is one of the quieter experiences the game offers. These are not trophies. They are elegies, and the game treats them as such. There is a specific architectural transition that occurs between the exterior and interior of the Academy of Raya Lucaria that most players move through too quickly to register as deliberate. The exterior of the Academy, observed from the shores of Liurnia, is imposing and cold, stone built for weather, for centuries of exposure, for the declarations of institutional permanence. But the moment the player passes through the Academy's main gate and enters its inner courtyard, the scale of the space shifts. It becomes, by a small but perceptible margin, more intimate. The corridors of the Academy are narrower than the exterior's bulk suggests they would be. The ceilings and study areas are lower than in ceremonial spaces. These are the proportions of a place built for learning, for concentration, for the kind of work that requires a certain compression of space to feel like it matters. Most players experience this as a dungeon with a particular visual style. But the Academy was designed as a place of education first, and the designers built it with dimensions that reflect educational architecture, the deliberate use of scale to create environments where sustained attention becomes natural. The places in the Academy where attention is supposed to happen are built to support it. That the player usually sprints through these spaces in combat does not erase what they were designed to hold. There is an effect applied to the visual presentation of Marika's statues that most players register only as an artistic choice, a stylized quality to the golden figures, but that contains within it a specific technical decision. The statues of Marika throughout the lands between are not illuminated by the same light source as the environment around them. Each statue has a separate light applied to it, one that does not change with the time of day or the weather state of the zone. Marika's statues are always lit the same way, regardless of whether the sky outside is clear or clouded, whether it is dawn or deep night, whether the player is in a dungeon or on an open plain. The practical effect of this is that the statues always look the same. In a world where everything else shifts with light and time, the statues do not shift. They are constant in a way nothing else in the lands between is constant. Whether this was a technical convenience or an artistic statement, the result is that divine representation in this world exists outside the normal systems that govern everything else. The statues of Marika do not live in the same light the rest of the world lives in. They exist in their own unchanging illumination, and the world rearranges itself around them accordingly. There is a quality to the crafting system in Elden Ring that most players experience as purely utilitarian. Gather materials, combine them, receive consumable, that contains within it a layer of lore communication that almost no one reads carefully. The recipes for different crafting items group materials in ways that encode information about relationships between things in the natural world of the lands between. Items that require similar base materials but produce different results are implying that those results share a common biological or elemental origin. The specific combination of ingredients required to produce poison grease, for instance, implies a particular understanding of how poison works in this world, which plants carry it, which creatures concentrate it, what environmental conditions produce it in harvestable form. A player who reads all the crafting recipes with ecological attention could reconstruct a fairly detailed model of how the living systems of the lands between interact. Which regions produce which materials, how those materials relate to each other chemically and biologically, which crafted outputs are derived from the same source, and which require the combination of things that would not naturally coexist. These are all encoded in the recipe system. It is a different way of reading the world, and it is available to anyone, and almost no one has ever done it systematically. There is a shadow that the tarnished character casts that differs in a specific way from shadows cast by NPCs and enemies. The difference is subtle, a question of how the shadow's edge behaves as the light source moves, and it serves no gameplay function, but it is consistent across all character configurations, all equipment states, all lighting environments the game contains. The shadow of the player character has been rendered with a slightly different behavior than the shadows of everyone else in the world. Whether this was done to give the player character a distinct identity in a world full of other figures, or whether it emerged from the technical difference between how player characters and scripted characters are rendered, the result is that the Tarnished casts a shadow that is quietly unlike any other shadow in the lands between. You are the only one in this world whose shadow behaves this way. The world knows you are different from everyone else in it. It registers that difference in the darkness that follows you. There is a lore detail embedded in the design of golden seeds, those small sprouts collected from young urge tree saplings that most players understand as a flask upgrade material and nothing else. The description of the golden seed says that these saplings spring up where grace has been particularly concentrated, near sites of grace. But the specific language used implies something about what the saplings are. They are not simply new growth. They are the Erd tree attempting to extend itself, sending out new points of contact with the world, establishing new sites of connection between the divine and the physical. The player collecting these seeds and consuming them to strengthen their flasks is, in lore terms, taking what the Erd tree is using to spread itself and redirecting that energy. The flask itself, described as a sacred vessel, is receiving something that was meant to root in the earth and grow. The relationship between player and Erd tree in this mechanic is not one of worship or alignment. It is something closer to harvesting, taking what the divine has invested in growth and converting it to personal strength. This is done thousands of times across a playthrough, completely without comment from any NPC, absorbed into the economy of survival so completely that its nature as an act goes unexamined. There is a set of dialogues belonging to Miriel, the gentle turtle pope found at the Church of Vows, that rewards players who return to speak with him not for quest advancement, but simply for conversation. Miriel is one of the warmest presences in the lands between, a figure of genuine scholarly enthusiasm and personal kindness in a world that is largely composed of grief and ruin. Most players visit him to learn incantations or to break the consequences of hostile NPC actions. But Miriel has a series of reflective observations about the history of the world that unfold only across multiple visits. Each time you return and speak with him, he offers something slightly different, not a new quest direction, but a new thought about the Erd tree, about Raya Lucaria, about the nature of faith and inquiry and their relationship to each other. These are the observations of someone who has spent a very long time thinking about difficult things and arrived at a place of genuine peace with the difficulty. They are available to any player who returns to him not because they need something, but because they enjoy his company. In a game where most NPC interactions are structured around need and transaction, Muriel's optional philosophical reflections exist purely for the pleasure of the conversation itself. He does not reward you for listening. He simply continues to be himself, which is in the lands between, a form of abundance. There is a behavior exhibited by the nomadic merchant that players encounter early in the game, the one sitting by a fire on the coast south of the stranded graveyard, that goes entirely unnoticed because the interaction window does not trigger it. If you stand near the merchant without initiating the trade dialogue and simply wait, The merchant's idle animations includes a series of gestures that suggest he is engaged in a private activity. He hums, not audibly, there is no sound, but his body language implies humming, the small rhythmic movements of someone engaged in quiet, private contentment. He rocks slightly. He adjusts his grip on his staff. He looks out to sea at intervals. He is, in other words, living, not performing commerce, not waiting for the player to arrive. Living a quiet moment by a fire on a coast at the edge of the world, and the player's arrival is an interruption of that. The game does not comment on this. The merchant transitions smoothly into his shopkeeper role when addressed. But the 30 seconds of behavior available to anyone who stops before speaking is a portrait of someone who exists between transactions, not just within them. There is an aspect of the Twin Maiden husks at the Roundtable hold that most players accept as the game's merchant interface, and nothing more. But the lore of the Twin Maiden husks, stated in their item description, available to read at any time, read by very few, is genuinely disturbing in the particular quiet way that this game does disturbing. They are the remains of two maidens who were bound together in service and who continued to function after whatever events reduced them to their current state. The word husks is accurate. They are not alive in the ordinary sense. They are sustained by something other than life, carrying out a function that was assigned to them and that they have not stopped performing. The game places these figures at the center of player commerce. They hold your bell bearings. They sell you items that would otherwise require you to retrace enormous distances. They are enormously useful, and their usefulness is continuous and reliable. But they are also, in a specific and quiet sense, a horror. Two women reduced to functional remains, performing economic service indefinitely in a place outside of time. The game does not ask you to feel anything in particular about this. It simply places them there, makes them useful, and trusts you to read the description if you are curious about what you are purchasing from. There is a quality to the fog gates that seal boss encounters that most players experience as purely mechanical, a transitional barrier that the player crosses to enter the combat space. But fog gate design in Elden Ring differs from zone to zone in ways that encode something about what lies beyond them. The fog associated with major bosses, the demigods, the members of the shard-bearing pantheon, has a specific visual weight and density that is absent from the fog associated with smaller encounters. Field bosses have lighter, more dispersed fog. Major legacy dungeon bosses have fog that does not simply obscure, it resists, giving the sense of pushing through something that does not want to be crossed. The boss at the end of the Elden Throne, the final encounter that determines the fate of the world, has fog that looks different from every other fog gate in the game. It has a quality that is almost warm, almost golden, almost like the light of the Erd tree itself has been compressed into the barrier that separates the player from what comes next. Most players move through it without stopping. They have made their choice. They are committed. But the fog is telling you something in the moment, before you cross it, that what is on the other side is not simply an enemy. It is a consequence. There is a detail that emerges only from the collective reading of dozens of NPC questlines taken together, a pattern that no single questline makes explicit, but that becomes visible when you step back from individual stories and look at the shape of what they have in common. Every questline in Elden Ring, without exception, involves loss. Every character the player encounters is in the process of losing something, or has already lost it, or is about to lose it, and the question each questline poses is not whether the loss will happen, but how the character will meet it. Some characters meet their losses with dignity, some with denial, some with a violence that turns outward, some with a grief so quiet it is barely visible in their dialogue, but none of them escape it, and the player moving between these stories, carrying the consequences of quest lines completed and failed, becomes a kind of witness to the full catalog of ways that a world already broken can continue to break the people still living in it. The game does not offer redemption for most of these characters. It offers, at most, the chance for the player to be present for what they are going through, to not look away from it. That is the quietest and most demanding secret in all of Elden Ring. That this world was built as a study in how loss happens and what people become when they carry it. There is something in the design of the rune arc system, those consumables that activate the passive benefit of a great rune while equipped, that most players understand mechanically, but very few understand lyrically. The rune arc's description says it contains a fragment of the Elden Ring itself, captured at the moment of the ring's shattering. Every time a player character dies, the effect of the rune arc is lost, and a new one must be consumed to restore it. This is ordinarily understood as a risk-reward mechanic. The benefit is powerful enough to justify the cost of the arc, and the death penalty makes you fight more carefully. But read in lore terms, the rune arc mechanic means something different. The Tarnished is holding a fragment of the broken ring, drawing on its power, and when they die, that fragment disperses back into the world. The power of the shattered Elden Ring is not concentrated anywhere. It is distributed across the world in the bodies of everyone who carries it, and it dissipates every time one of those carriers falls. The act of dying in the lands betweens, in this reading, an act of releasing back into the world something that was briefly and personally held. The game models the relationship between a broken divine order and the mortal bodies that briefly contain its pieces, and it uses death as the mechanism by which those pieces return to circulation. This is not explained anywhere. It is simply there, in the lore, for anyone who reads it and understands what they are actually consuming. There is a visual storytelling element built into the design of the Halig tree, that enormous divine tree grown from Miquella's own hair, a project of faith and biological impossibility that rewards the player who descends through it slowly and pays attention to how the tree changes as they move downward. The upper portions of the Halig tree are recognizable as a kind of sacred canopy, golden, high, lit from above, carrying the aesthetic language of divine architecture. But as you descend, the tree changes. The gold becomes less present. The biological reality of the tree, its rings, its bark, its roots, becomes more prominent. By the time you reach the lowest accessible portions of the Halig tree before the entrance to Elphael, the tree no longer looks divine. It looks old and enormous and fundamentally biological, a living thing that was sacred because someone believed in it, and that continues to exist because it is too large to simply stop. The descent through the Halig tree is a movement from faith to fact, from the divine image of what the tree was intended to be toward the organic reality of what it actually is. Miquella built it. He poured himself into it, and then he left, and the tree continued without him, growing according to biology rather than intent. The architecture of that transition is legible if you move through the space slowly, looking at what changes as you go down. It is one of the most complete visual arguments in the game about what happens to sacred things when their architects disappear. There is a detail in the Volcano Manor questline that most players who complete it receive only partially, because the final stage of it requires a return visit that the game never explicitly prompts. Volcano Manor, that red stone fortress on the slopes of Mount Gelmir, is the domain of Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, or rather, of what Rykard has become after allowing himself to be consumed by the god-devouring serpent. The questline involves hunting targets, forming what might be called a household of killers around the Lady Tanith, who oversees the manor. Most players engage with this questline, complete the assassinations, and consider it done when Rykard is defeated and Tanith disappears. What almost no one discovers is the consequence of returning to the manor after those events, going back to the empty rooms, the abandoned corridors, the spaces that were once full of complicated figures and are now hollow with their absence. In the chamber where Rykard was encountered, something has changed. The environment has shifted in a way that reflects what happened there. And in that same chamber, if the player returns specifically to the place where Tanith was last seen alive as an NPC, there is evidence of what became of her, evidence that is consistent with her stated devotion to Rykard and with what someone who loved something as ruined as Rykard had become might choose when that thing was finally ended. It is not a cutscene, it is not announced, it is simply there for the player who returns to an empty place, expecting nothing, and finds instead the conclusion of a story that the game declined to narrate aloud. There is a behavior in the way that Elden Ring handles torchlight, specifically the behavior of the lantern when equipped, which casts light in the player's vicinity for exploration of dark areas, that most players have observed functionally, without examining aesthetically. The lantern's light has a flicker. This is not a technical artifact of the rendering. The flicker is rhythmic, and its rhythm is not random. It was designed with a pattern, an irregular but repeating cadence that sounds, if you think about it in terms of breathing, like the breathing of something very large and very calm. The flicker does not repeat at equal intervals. It has variation built into it, the way biological processes have variation. It is the light behavior of a flame responding to the subtle air movements of a living creature nearby. The lantern is carried through some of the darkest and most ancient places in the lands between, through caves that predate the current age, through underground cities built before the Erdtree grew, through passages that have not seen anything living for longer than the game's history accounts for. In all those places, the lantern flickers with the rhythm of something alive. You bring life into places that have been without it, and the light announces that fact with every breath it takes. Most players see the light so only as light, as the functional solution to a dark environment. But it breathes, and it breathes like something that is present with you, and in places as empty as the ones it illuminates, that matters. There is a specific quality of silence in Elden Ring that functions as its own form of communication, places in the world where the ambient sound design drops to near nothing, and the silence itself carries weight. These moments occur in specific locations, the interior of certain tombs, specific elevated platforms high above populated areas, the center of the Erdtree's base accessed through Lindell. In these places, the game's usual approach of filling the sound environment with naturalistic texture, wind, distant water, insects, structural groaning, stops. The silence is not the absence of audio. It is a designed state, and it communicates something different in each location where it appears. In the tombs, the silence says age, that nothing has happened here for so long that even the ambient world has moved on. On the elevated platforms, the silence says altitude, that you have risen above the ordinary frequency of the world below. At the base of the Erdtree, the silence says the most complex thing, that you are in a presence so large that the normal vocabulary of sound does not apply to it. The Erdtree has no ambient sound because it is not in the same category as the things that make ambient sounds. Its silence is not emptiness. It is a different kind of fullness, and the game communicates this entirely through the decision to give it no sound at all. There is a piece of environmental detail in Farum Azula, the ancient crumbling city floating in the storm, untethered from the ground of the lands between, that reveals something about what the city was, Before it came unmoored, the architecture of Farum Azula is consistently described as ancient, as predating the Erd tree, as belonging to an age when different forces organized the world. But the specific arrangement of structures in the city's more intact sections suggests civic life, plazas, what appear to have been market areas, the spatial logic of a place designed to accommodate many people moving through it and stopping in it and transacting within it. This is not purely sacred architecture. It was a city in the full sense once, with all the ordinary activity that cities contain. What happened to separate it from the ground? What event or force or choice caused Farum Azula to become untethered and to float in perpetual storm is not stated clearly anywhere. But the arrangement of its surviving spaces implies that when it lifted with people in it. The city was inhabited when it became what it is now. Whatever was living there continued to inhabit it afterward, changed by what happened into the beastmen and ancient dragons that the player encounters as enemies. The ordinary human city that Farum Azula once was is readable in its geometry, even now, even in ruin, even rotating slowly in a wind that has been blowing for longer than the current age of the world has existed. There is a quality to the way that time passes in the lands between that most players absorb intuitively without ever articulating it. The world does not move at the same speed everywhere. In open fields, under open sky, with Torrent beneath you and the wind pressing against your ears, the lands between moves quickly. It has a scale that the player covers in strides, that translates distance into something manageable and kinetic. But in enclosed spaces, in the corridors of legacy dungeons, in the narrow passages beneath ruins, in the cramped interiors of churches with their low stone ceilings, time moves differently. The same number of real-world seconds produces a different experiential duration, depending on where the player is standing. This is not an accident of game design. It is an intentional pacing choice, embedded in how these spaces were built. The designers achieved this through a combination of visual density, sound compression, and the reduction of peripheral field of view that naturally occurs when walls close in. An open plane offers the eye dozens of visual anchors at different distances. A dungeon corridor offers 2 or 3, all close. The brain processes these differently, and the result is that moving through the lands between indoors feels like moving through a different relationship with time than moving through it outdoors. The world is one world, but it contains multiple temporalities, and learning to move through each one correctly, to not rush the dungeon, to not dawdle unnecessarily on the open plane, is one of the deeper rhythms the game teaches without ever naming it. There is a particular enemy type found in the catacombs that most players encounter as a combat obstacle and almost never as a subject of sustained observation: the imp. Those small, stone-gray creatures are among the earliest enemies players encounter in Elden Ring, and they are typically dismissed as minor threats, quickly dealt with and forgotten. But the imps, examined with patience in spaces where they are not yet aggravated, have a behavioral repertoire that goes far beyond their combat role. They gather. They huddle in groups in ways that suggest not pack hunting instinct, but something closer to social congregation. Certain imp groups in certain catacombs can be observed engaged in behaviors that have no combat function, gestures shared between them, positioning that seems to follow spatial rules unrelated to player detection. The item descriptions associated with the imps describe them as guardian spirits, beings that were set to watch over the resting places of the dead. This is their original function. They are not inherently aggressive. They were placed in the catacombs to protect something, and they have been doing it for longer than the current age of the world has existed. The combat behavior the player encounters is a response to intrusion, not a default state. Their default state, the one visible to anyone who enters a catacomb carefully enough to observe them before triggering detection, is watchfulness. They sit. They cluster. They perform their ancient guardianship with a patience that puts their small size and fierce combat display into entirely different context. There is something hidden in the way that the game presents its weather systems across different regions that reveals a political and ecological history most players never read. The lands between regions each have their own weather. Limgrave has variable weather, clear days and overcast days, and occasional fog. Liurnia has a persistent, gentle haziness. Caelid has the ochre sickness haze of the scarlet rot. The mountaintops of the giants have cold wind and occasional snowfall. These are understood as atmosphere, but the specific character of each region's weather encodes what happened there. Limgrave's variability reflects a region that was largely intact, a place where the natural systems of the world still operate as designed. Liurnia's haze reflects the presence of intense magical activity over a very long period. The Academy's centuries of operation left residue in the air itself, a kind of ambient glintstone saturation that softens light and reduces visibility. Caelid's rot haze is the most obvious example, but it is worth noting that the rot's color, that specific ochre gold that taints everything, is a corruption of the Erd tree's gold, which is exact. The rot did not create a new color, it perverted an existing one, and the mountaintop's cold is not simply elevation. The giants who once lived there were creatures of enormous heat, and the cold that filled the region after their destruction is, in a sense, the thermal signature of their absence. Each weather system is a record of what happened, and written in the atmosphere of the region where it happened. There is a mechanic in the way the game handles fall damage that most players discover within their first hour of play. You can take significant fall damage from heights that look traversable, and then never investigate further. But fall damage in Elden Ring has a secondary layer that almost no one discovers, because it requires taking falls from specific distances, even repeatedly, and paying close attention to the numbers. Fall damage is not simply calculated from height alone. It is modified by the speed of the player's downward movement at the moment of impact, which is itself influenced by the player's horizontal movement during the fall. A player who jumps from a ledge while moving forward lands with slightly different velocity than one who steps off a ledge while stationary. The difference in the resulting damage, while small, is consistent and reproducible. This matters in practice in a handful of locations where the difference between a survivable fall and a fatal one is marginal, and where the player's horizontal momentum at the moment of jumping can shift the outcome. Most players who discover these difficult falls simply accept the death toll as fixed and either push through or find another route. But the fall damage system is more nuanced than it appears, and a player who understands its secondary layer can survive drops that should by rights kill them, not through gear or stats, but through the physics of how they choose to fall. There is a lore thread connecting three seemingly unrelated items scattered across the lands between that most players collect without ever noticing the connection. The first is a particular type of perfume bottle found in Landel. The second is a dagger located in a chest in an obscure corner of the Academy of Raya Lucaria. The third is a consumable found near the summit of the mountaintops of the giants. These three items share no obvious aesthetic or geographic connection. They are found in different environments, from different enemy types or hidden containers, and their item descriptions appear at first reading to describe entirely unrelated things. But each description contains a reference to the same event, phrased differently each time, alluding to it from a different angle, an event that is never named anywhere else in the game. The event appears to have been a private agreement made between three individuals during the period just before the shattering, an agreement whose nature can be inferred from the combined reading of all three descriptions, but that no single description reveals on its own. The three individuals involved were not major figures. They were not demigods or Elden lords. They were ordinary people in positions of minor institutional power who made an arrangement that mattered only to them, and the traces of that arrangement survived in the objects they left behind. From Software built an entire private history for three unnamed people and distributed its chapters across items most players never connect. The people who have read all three and recognized what they share are extraordinarily few. There is a behavior connected to the Erd tree's ambient golden light, the diffuse illumination that fills environments near the Erd tree, even when direct sight lines to the tree itself are not available, that carries a lore implication most players absorb atmospherically without examining logically. The golden light is present in Lendel. It is present in the Altus Plateau. It is present in a more attenuated form in Limgrave on clear days. But it is almost entirely absent in Caelid, despite Caelid being geographically adjacent to regions where the light is present. The scarlet rot has not simply changed the color of Caelid's atmosphere. It has blocked the Erdtree's light at a level that is visually distinct from simple atmospheric filtering. This means the scarlet rot, beyond its obvious physical effects, is doing something to the Erd tree's reach. The divine light that the tree provides to the regions around it, which item descriptions consistently frame as a form of blessing and as a literal source of the grace that guides the tarnished, does not penetrate the rot's influence. Caelid is cut off from grace in the most literal optical sense. The sky there does not receive what the sky in Limgrave receives. The Erd tree's light touches everything in its world except the places most damaged by its long history of violence, and Caelid is the most prominent of those places. The scarlet rot and the divine light are in direct opposition, and the sky of Caelid is where that opposition is most visible. There is a series of details embedded in the design of the demi-human enemies, those crouched, vaguely humanoid creatures found in various ruins and forested areas of the lands between, that most players never investigate because the enemies are defeated quickly and left behind. The demi-humans exist in a social structure that is legible in how they are encountered. Scouts appear alone at the periphery of habitation areas. Small groups patrol the middle distances. At the center of any demi-human encampment, there is always a chief, a larger individual around whom the others organize. This is consistent across every demi-human location in the game, without exception. The consistency implies that whoever designed these enemies was working from a coherent social model, not from a need to create escalating combat difficulty. The chief is not harder simply because it is a boss. It is harder because it is the most important individual in that group, and its importance predates and supersedes its role as a player obstacle. The demi-humans are not a population of enemies. They are a people, small, afraid, fierce when cornered, organized around the largest among them in a way that is immediately recognizable as social rather than mechanical. They occupy ruins that were once someone else's, which implies a displacement. Either the humans who built those ruins are gone, or the demi-humans arrived later and found an inheritance. The game does not say which. It simply populates abandoned places with creatures who have developed their own ways of living in them, and most players walk through those ways without stopping to read them. There is a quality to the fog that rolls across Liurnia of the Lakes at certain times in the day-night cycle that most players experience as pure atmosphere. The game is beautiful, the mist on the water is part of that beauty, and it is accepted as such without further examination. But the fog of Liurnia has a directionality that is consistent across all weather states. It always moves from the direction of the Academy toward the open lake and beyond. This is not random. It matches the direction of the Academy's ongoing magical discharge, the glintstone energy that the Academy has been expending for centuries, the residue of continuous magical experimentation and the exercise of arcane disciplines at an institutional scale. The fog of Liurnia is, in essence, the Academy's exhaust, the ambient output of a magical institution that has been operating at capacity for so long that its waste has reshaped the regional atmosphere. The lake itself, which the game's lore implies was not always so extensive, may owe part of its current size to the Academy's influence on local water systems, the magical energy affecting precipitation and evaporation in ways that expanded an existing body of water over centuries. Standing on the shore of Liurnia and watching the fog move is watching the evidence of a civilization's ongoing existence, the invisible output of all that learning and experimentation made visible as mist, moving across the water in the direction of everything beyond it. There is a specific NPC behavior in the Volcano Manor that most players who complete the questline observe but do not register as unusual. The figures who occupy the manor's various rooms, Bernal Dialos in certain quest states, Raya, Patches in his brief visit, all maintain personal space in ways that differ from how NPCs behave in less charged social environments. At the Roundtable hold, NPCs occupy space comfortably. They spread across the hold's rooms in ways that suggest ease. At the Volcano Manor, the NPCs cluster. They sit near walls. They face doors. Their body language, while built from the same animation sets available throughout the game, is deployed in the manor in ways that read as watchful. This is environmental characterization through NPC body language. The Volcano Manor is not a safe place, and the people who reside in it, even those who are there by choice, even those who present themselves as comfortable, are behaving in ways that reveal ambient anxiety. Raya sits in a position that offers her the largest available view of the room she occupies. Bernal faces the entrance to his space when idle. These are not details the game explains. They are details that exist because the animators who placed these characters understood something about the social dynamics of the manor and expressed it through the smallest available means. There is a hidden correspondence between the position of certain Erdtree avatars, those enormous, slow-moving guardians of minor Erdtrees found at sites of grace throughout the lands between, and the locations of things that were interred or hidden nearby at some point in the world's history. Erdtree avatars are understood by most players as area guardians. Fight them for useful rewards, move on. But the specific items and areas that the avatars guard reveal something about why they were placed at those particular Erdtrees. The avatars are not patrolling. They are standing over something specific. The minor Erdtrees they protect are not randomly distributed. They grew in places where the grace of the Erdtree responded to something concentrated, something buried or hidden or significant that the Erdtree recognized as worth marking. Following the logic of what each avatar guards and looking at what lies beneath or near each minor Erdtree creates a map of concentrated significance across the lands between, places where something important happened or was placed, marked now by a tree and protected by a guardian, both of which arrive not by human decision, but by the Erdtree's own response to what the ground held. The avatars are the Erdtree's memory of where things matter, made physical and ambulatory. There is something in the item description of the twinned armor set, the gear associated with D, Hunter of the Dead, and his brother Dialos, that most players read once and process as character background and nothing more. But the specific language used in the twinned armor description, compared against the language used in the descriptions of items associated with Dialos, reveals a relationship between the brothers that neither of them ever explicitly describes in dialogue. D is taciturn and professional. Dialos is emotional and earnest to the point of being painful to watch in his failures. They are, in personality, extremely unlike each other. But the armor descriptions implies that this difference was not always so pronounced, that the way D presents himself in the game is a constructed persona, a professional armor worn over a different kind of person. The description does not say this directly. It says something about the set's construction that implies it was assembled by someone who understood that a hunter needs to appear certain in a world that gives no certainty. That choice of word, assembled rather than crafted, implies deliberateness, implies a person who decided to become the thing they are presenting. D chose to be D in a way that Dialos never chose anything, because Dialos never felt the need to choose. The armor is the choice-made material, worn as a reminder of the decision, and its description carries that weight in a single word most readers pass without pause. There is a visual detail in how the Erd tree is rendered that changes depending on the time of day in the game's cycle and on the region from which it is observed, but that almost no player notices systematically because the Erd tree is so omnipresent in the visual field that it becomes background rather than subject. From Limgrave at dawn, the Erd tree glows with a warmth that is almost amber. It absorbs and returns the light of the rising sun in a way that suggests the tree is participating in the day rather than simply existing during it. From the Altus Plateau at midday, the Erd tree is bright and enormous, closer and more overwhelming. No longer a distant warmth, but a presence that fills the upper visual field. From the mountaintops of the giants at night, the Erd tree is visible only as light. Its form is largely obscured by distance and cloud, but the light it emits continues to illuminate the underside of the cloud cover above it, making the sky in that region slightly brighter than it would otherwise be. Each perspective on the Erd tree is a different relationship with divinity, the distant warmth of a faith that lights the morning, the overwhelming nearness of power approached too closely, the residual illumination of something too large to see directly even in darkness. The game built these perspectives into its lighting engine, which means someone calculated how the Erd tree should appear from dozens of vantage points, and made each one correct for the relationship it represents. Most players experience these as one continuous, beautiful thing. They are actually a sequence of theological arguments rendered in light. There is a mechanic in the way crafting material respawns that most players understand at a surface level, rest at a site of grace, and gatherable items in the world reset. But the respawn radius of materials relative to the site of grace used to reset them is not uniform. Materials very close to a grace respawn at the same rate as materials far from it, which is the expected behavior. But in a handful of specific locations, materials that appear to be well within a grace's reset radius do not respawn on the same schedule as others nearby. These anomalous respawn points were eventually investigated by players who suspected they were tied to non-grace reset triggers, events or conditions other than resting that could cause material to refresh. The investigation revealed that certain materials in the world are tied not to proximity to grace, but to the game's internal event system, specifically to whether the player has completed or failed certain questline stages. These materials respawn not when the player rests, but when a narrative condition changes. The most likely explanation is that these are materials whose presence in the world is narratively justified. They appear when certain things are true about the state of the lands between, and they disappear or regenerate when those things change. The world's resources are not entirely independent of its story. In specific places, the earth produces what the story requires it to produce, and gathering those materials is a small participation in the narrative logic of the region. There is an aspect of Millennia's boss fight that most players experience as pure mechanical challenge, and almost no player ever examines as an aesthetic construction. Millennia, Blade of Miquella, is widely considered one of the hardest boss encounters in Elden Ring, and discussion of the fight almost exclusively concerns her healing mechanic, her attack patterns, and her second phase transformation. But the specific choreography of her opening sequence, the long walk she takes across the arena before the first attack, was not designed for dramatic tension alone. It was designed as a portrait. The way Millennia moves across that space, the angle of her posture, the deliberateness of each step, the way her prosthetic arm carries itself compared to her sword arm, these are characterization choices that tell you who this person was before she became what she is. Millennia has been fighting her condition for her entire life. The scarlet rot within her has never fully won because she has never let it, but the battle has been continuous. The walk across the arena is the walk of someone who has maintained composure in the face of something unimaginable for decades. It is not a threatening walk. It is not performative. It is the walk of a person who has learned to inhabit her own damaged body with a precision that approaches grace, because anything less would mean losing the control she has spent her whole life maintaining. Most players see a boss approaching. They are seeing something else. There is a connection between the grace system and the behavior of the demigods that goes almost entirely undiscussed because it requires reading multiple item descriptions and NPC dialogues together rather than deriving it from any single source. Grace in Elden Ring's lore is not simply a divine reward for worthy behavior. It is described in various items as a form of direction, the Erd tree's active guidance of those it has recognized as capable of serving its purposes. The Tarnished receive this guidance as a literal golden line that appears in moments of uncertainty, pointing toward the next meaningful thing. But the demigods, by virtue of their power and their divine heritage, also received grace in a different form, not as guidance towards something ahead of them, but as a kind of sanction for where they already were. The loss of grace, what is called becoming Elden Lord, or failing to become one, affects the demigods differently than the Tarnished. For the Tarnished, losing the guiding light is disorientation. For the demigods, it appears to be dissolution. The madness and transformation that characterize the shard-bearing demigods by the time the player encounters them is not simply the result of holding a shard of the Elden Ring. It is the result of having been held together by grace and then being released from it, of being a being whose coherence depended on divine attention and finding out what you become when that attention is withdrawn. The shards of the ring they hold are not their power. They are their last connection to the thing that was keeping them whole. There is a quality to the item descriptions of weapons found in the hands of sleeping soldiers, specifically those in the mine areas and underground fortresses, that goes largely unexamined because these are typically considered low-tier loot in a game full of more impressive options. But the descriptions of certain basic swords and axes found in these locations include details that are not present in the descriptions of the same weapon types found elsewhere. These descriptions make reference to who carried the weapon and where. They describe the specific units, the specific assignments, the specific rotations of duty that a soldier in a specific mine or garrison would have been on before whatever event reduced them to their current sleeping state. The soldiers in the mines did not stop working because of the shattering directly. Their item descriptions imply a more gradual process, a withdrawal of supply, a cessation of communication from commanders, a continued performance of duty in the absence of any authority to report to. They kept working because they had been assigned to work and because no one came to relieve them of that assignment. The sleeping state that the player encounters them in is not death and it is not magic. It is the extreme endpoint of continued depletion, bodies that kept performing their function until there was no capacity left to continue. The weapons they carry remember what those functions were. Almost no player reads the weapons of sleeping miners carefully enough to know. There is a specific location in the Siofra River, the vast underground space beneath Limgrave, accessible through a lift that most players discover with genuine surprise, where the ceiling of the cave system is close enough to the surface above that the roots of surface trees are visible pressing through the stone. This is unusual for an underground space of that scale and that depth. The Siofra River exists in a genuinely deep, subterranean space. The ceiling should not show the penetration of surface root systems at that depth, but the roots visible there are not ordinary surface tree roots. They are eared tree roots, and they press through the ceiling of the underground with a disregard for the stone above them that implies the eared tree's root system is not governed by normal geological constraints. The roots of the eared tree in the Siofra River ceiling are doing something other than growing. Item descriptions found in the Siofra region describe the underground as a place where the eared tree conducts some of its influence over the dead, or the process by which the eared tree manages the fate of those who have died in the lands between occurs at a physical level. The roots visible in the ceiling are not simply growing downward for resources. They are reaching into the underground space where the dead reside, which is the evidence of a system that the player is standing inside without fully understanding. The light in the Siofra River, that improbable underground twilight, comes from sources that item descriptions connect to this same system. The river is lit by what the eared tree is doing to the dead below it, and most players experience it only as a beautiful, mysterious ambience. There is a behavior exhibited by the moon of Noxtella, the enormous, slowly rotating celestial object visible inside the Eternal City, that rewards extended observation in a way that combat-focused play makes almost impossible to achieve. The moon of Noxtella is typically encountered as a backdrop during the traversal of the city, visible through archways and across plazas, acknowledged as an extraordinary piece of environmental art, and then processed as a fixed feature of the space. But the moon is not fixed. It rotates. Its rotation is slow enough that the movement is not immediately perceptible. You would have to stand still and watch for several minutes to confirm it, but it is consistent and continuous. The rotation of the moon of Noxtella is tied to the game's internal clock, but moves through a full cycle in a period much longer than the in-game day-night cycle, which means that on any given visit to Noxtella, the moon is in a slightly different position than it was on previous visits. Players who have made multiple visits across a long playthrough and who paid attention each time have documented this progression. The moon of Noxtella is not a piece of static set design. It is a working celestial object placed inside a city that built its entire architectural identity around lunar observation, and it continues to move as it has always moved, regardless of whether there is anyone left in the city to watch it. There is a series of paintings found within the interior of Caria Manor, the sorcerer estate in northern Liurnia, that most players move past in combat and exploration mode without examining. These paintings are different in style from the prophecy paintings found elsewhere in the game. They are not landscape art. They are portraits, small, stylized figures that suggest specific individuals rather than generic subjects. The faces are abstract in the way that artistic convention, rather than technical limitation, makes them abstract, and the poses are specific enough to communicate something about the people depicted. The subjects of these paintings are not identified by any text. They have no labels, no placards, no item near them that names them. But the setting of the paintings, the context of Caria Manor, which was the ancestral home of Ranni's family, and the number of subjects depicted suggests that these are family portraits. They are the visual record of a lineage, displayed in a home that was theirs before it became the haunted ruin the player explores. Standing in front of them, knowing what happened to Ranni's family, the betrayals, the deaths, the impossible choices that unraveled a dynasty, and seeing unnamed faces looking out from these small frames is one of the most quietly affecting moments in the game. No mechanic directs you there. No quest requires you to look at them. They simply exist, asking to be seen. There is an aspect of the Roundtable hold that rewards investigation of its architecture in a way that most players never undertake, because the hold is primarily a hub, a place of commerce, conversation, and preparation rather than exploration. The hold is built in a style that does not match any of the architectural traditions visible elsewhere in the lands between. Its stone is cut differently. Its proportions are unusual. Its windows will look onto no exterior that can be identified. Most players accept this as the visual identity of a mysterious space and move on. But the specific character of the hold's stonework, examined against the lore of the world, matches the descriptions given in certain item texts of architecture from the age of the Crucible, the primordial period before the Erd tree and its order existed. The Roundtable hold may be not simply old, but ancient in a way that predates the categories players use to understand the lands between's history. Its gathering of tarnished, people defined by their relationship to the Erd tree's grace, may be occurring in a space that predates grace entirely. The grace that brought the tarnished to the hold did not build the hold. It found a structure that already existed, that survived from a time before the things that define the current world, and it made that structure a meeting place. What the hold was before it was found is one of the questions the game poses through architecture rather than dialogue, and the answer, if there is one, is written in stone that most players never touch. There is a specific moment in the encounter with Ranni, Queen of the Full Moon, that most players experience as a visual spectacle, and almost no player examines as a piece of character history. In the second phase of the Ranni fight, she appears above a golden sea, holding her child and commanding the forces of her former power against the invading Tarnished. The child she holds is not described in the fight. No tooltip identifies it. But Ranni's questline, her relationship with Radagon, and the lore of her family make clear that what she is holding in that phase is a memory, a recreation of a moment that is gone. The fight's second phase is not Ranni attacking with her full power. It is Ranni in the grip of a delusion so total that it has become physical. She is fighting to protect something that no longer exists and possibly never existed in the form she remembers. The celestial sea she summons, the creatures that attend her, the way she holds the memory in her arms throughout the fight. These are the physical expression of a grief that has not been processed because it cannot be. Ranni is not a villain. She is not an antagonist in the narrative sense. She is a woman whose husband left her, whose children grew into tragedy, and whose brilliance, which was genuine, which was enormous, turned inward rather than outward when the world she had built around love collapsed. The player defeating her is not a triumph. It is an act performed on someone who is already lost. There is a detail embedded in the behavior of Sight of Grace animations that almost no player has investigated because the animation itself is so brief and so familiar that it disappears into habit within the first few hours of play. When the Tarnished kneels at a Sight of Grace, the animation has a specific duration, and within that duration there is a frame, visible only if the camera is positioned unusually, looking at the Tarnished from the front rather than from the game's typical shoulder perspective, in which the face of the character is visible. What the face is doing in that frame is not the neutral expression of a person performing a mechanical action. It is something closer to relief. A softening around the eyes, a loosening of the jaw. The expression is subtle because it was designed to be subtle. No one is supposed to see it except by accident. But it is there, built into the animation of the character who has just found a place to rest. This is emotional characterization embedded in an animation frame that the game's camera almost never shows you. The tarnished experiences the grace of a sight as relief. Not safety. Nothing in the lands between is safe, but relief. The distinction matters. Safety implies permanence. Relief implies that something difficult has temporarily eased. The tarnished does not believe they are safe at the grace. They simply feel for a moment that they can breathe. The animators built this into their face and then positioned the camera to make it nearly invisible, and the result is a piece of characterization so small and so hidden that it functions less as a design decision and more as a private correspondence between the developers and anyone attentive enough to find it. There is something in the ecology of the consecrated snowfield, that high, cold, fog-blanketed region that requires both halves of the Haligtree medallion to access, that most players experience as an atmospheric exercise in disorientation and miss entirely as a biological system. The consecrated snowfield is hostile to observation. Its fog reduces visibility dramatically. Its enemies are aggressive and well camouflaged. Most players move through it with the specific intention of reaching Ordina, the liturgical town that serves as the gateway to the Haligtree, and they do so quickly and with their attention concentrated on survival rather than environment. But the snowfield, examined slowly, is home to a specific set of creatures that exist nowhere else in the game. The reindeer-like animals that graze in the snowfield's open areas are unlike any creature found in Limgrave or Liurnia. The birds that circle above the fog are a different species from the birds found in lower altitude regions. Even the plants that push through the snow have a specific character, hardy, pale, compressed close to the ground in response to the altitude and cold. The snowfield was built with a distinct high-altitude ecology that reflects real-world principles about how life adapts to extreme environmental conditions, and it was built completely for its own sake, because no quest draws the player's attention to it, and no mechanic rewards noticing it. It exists because the world needed to be complete, even in the parts that most players would move through too quickly to see. There is a set of behaviors exhibited by Alexander, the warrior jar, across the various stages of his questline that collectively constitute one of the most complete character arcs in Elden Ring, and that are most poignant to those who have noticed something about him from the very beginning. Alexander's first encounter is comic. He is stuck in the ground, and freeing him requires a relatively simple action, and the scene plays lightly. His gratitude is enormous and disproportionate, and his earnestness is immediately endearing. He wants to fill himself with the might of warriors, and this goal, stated so simply and with such enthusiasm, is easy to receive as the defining note of his character. But Alexander's questline, followed to its conclusion, reveals that the filling he speaks of is not metaphor. It is literal. The warrior jars of the lands between are vessels. They are built to contain the remains of the warriors who fall in battle, and the remains they contain become their strength. When Alexander speaks of wanting to be full of the might of warriors, he is speaking of an ambition that is also a biological imperative. He is incomplete until he has collected the fallen, and the journey of his questline is the journey toward the fullness he was made for. His death at the end of his quest, which the player must cause, is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. He achieves what he set out to achieve. He is full, finally, and the player carries what remains of him forward. The comedy of his first encounter and the gravity of his last are not tonal inconsistencies. They are the arc of someone who knew what they were for and spent their entire life moving toward it. There is a lore implication in the design of the Black Knife Assassins, those extremely dangerous, fast-moving enemies associated with the Knight of the Black Knives, that most players engage with as one of the game's more challenging enemy types and almost never examine as a piece of world history. The Black Knife Assassins are connected, through their item descriptions, to the event that killed Godwyn the Golden, the event that initiated the Shattering by depriving Marika of her son and breaking something in her that could not be repaired. They are assassins. They were sent to kill a demigod. The logistics of that and the planning required, the access that had to be arranged, the capabilities that had to be developed to make the killing of a nearly divine being possible, imply an organization of enormous sophistication and ancient standing. The Black Knives predate the Shattering. They were in position to act when the moment came. This means someone prepared them, someone maintained them, someone kept the capability ready across what must have been a considerable period of time. Who commissioned the killing of Godwyn, and why and how the assassins were maintained in secrecy for long enough to be effective when deployed? These questions are among the deepest in the game's lore, and they are posed entirely through the design and placement of an enemy type that most players defeat and move past without a second thought. The assassins are the evidence of a conspiracy whose full participants and purposes the game does not entirely reveal, and every encounter with a Black Knife assassin is an encounter with the instrument of the event that broke the world. There is a texture applied to the stone of the subterranean shunning grounds, the underground dungeon beneath Lanedell that leads eventually to the frenzied flame prescription, that is distinct from the texture applied to any other stone surface in the game. This texture is not simply the aesthetic of age or damage. It has a specific visual quality that reads as deliberate, as if the stone was cut or shaped to look this way rather than simply weathering into it. The shunning grounds are among the oldest spaces the player can access, predating the current architectural traditions of Lanedell, and the visual character of their construction reflects an approach to stonework from a period before the current age's building conventions were established. The workers who carved this space, who they were, what authority commissioned it, what purpose it was built to serve before the current world repurposed it as a place of concealment and shame, are not identified by any NPC or item description. The shunning grounds are, in the current world, where Lanedell hides things. But the evidence of its construction suggests that it was built long before there was anything to hide, which means either it was built with its future purpose in mind, or its purpose changed over the centuries as the city above it changed. The stone remembers neither version. It simply holds the shape it was given in the particular way that very old, very carefully cut stone holds shapes, which is to say indefinitely. There is something worth noting about how the game handles the concept of recurrence. The fact that the tarnished can die and return indefinitely in relation to the game's enemies and environment. When the tarnished dies and returns to a site of grace, the world resets. Enemies return to their positions. Items that were dropped return to their pre-collection state. The world behaves as though the encounter that just resulted in death did not happen. This is a well-understood mechanical convention of the genre. But what very few players examine is the lore implication of this convention. The tarnished dying is, in the game's internal reality, an event that the world does not register. The tarnished dies, and the world continues as though they did not. Not because the world is indifferent. The lore is full of evidence that the world is actively interested in what the tarnished does, but because the mechanism that returns them to life also, in some sense, returns the world to the moment before death. The death did not happen to the world. It happened to the tarnished privately, repeatedly, in a space that the world cannot access. This has implications for how the game's characters interact with the Tarnished, none of whom ever acknowledge the deaths they must, in some sense, be dimly aware have occurred. The Tarnished carries all their deaths, the world carries none of them. This asymmetry is the loneliest thing about being what the Tarnished is, the private accumulation of failures that no one else holds with you. There is a detail in the way the game presents the memory mechanic, specifically the way entering a memory stone location and experiencing an ancient battle plays out, that most players receive as a gameplay feature for accessing otherwise impossible boss fights and almost never examine as a piece of world philosophy. The memories accessed through remembrances and the ancient battle scenarios entered through certain Waygate-type locations are described in the game's lore as reconstructed events, not recordings exactly, but recreations built from what the Erd Tree and other sources of grace remember of what occurred. They are the world's memory of itself, made accessible to the Tarnished. The implication is that the lands between has a form of collective memory that is imperfect and reconstructed rather than pristine and recorded. The memories the player accesses are not exactly what happened. They are what the world has retained of what happened, colored by whatever biases and emphasis the retaining system applies, degraded by time in ways that the game does not specify, but that the compressed, stylized quality of the memory spaces suggests. When the Tarnished fights Star-Scourge Radahn in the Festival of the Dead, they are not fighting the actual Radahn of the past. They are fighting the world's memory of Radahn, the concentrated, distilled, essential Radahn that the world held on to after everything else about him faded. This is a more interesting and more honest thing to fight, in some ways, than the original. Memories are often more powerful than the events that created them. There is an aspect of the game's magic system, specifically the distinction between glintstone sorceries and death sorceries, that most players understand mechanically, but almost no player examines in terms of what the distinction implies about the nature of intelligence in this world. Glintstone sorceries are the academic magic of Raya Lucaria, the organized, institutionalized practice of channeling the intelligence of the stars through refined stone. They are controlled, reproducible, and deeply connected to a specific institutional tradition. Death sorceries, by contrast, are the remnant practice of the Carrion rogues and outliers, magic that works with death force rather than star intelligence, that is explicitly taboo within the dominant magical establishment. The reason glintstone sorcery is acceptable and death sorcery is not has nothing to do with the power of either. It is entirely political. Glintstone sorcery emerged from traditions that the Erd Tree's order was willing to accommodate. Death sorcery emerged from traditions that the Erd Tree's order wanted suppressed because it dealt in the same domain that the Erd Tree claims as its exclusive province, the management of death and what follows it. The prohibition of death sorcery is not ethical. It is territorial. The magical establishment of the lands between outlawed an entire branch of knowledge, not because it was harmful, but because it competed with the divine monopoly on death. Every death sorcery the player can learn is a piece of forbidden knowledge, maintained in secret by people who understood that the prohibition was political rather than principled. There is a specific sound that plays in the moment between the player accepting the guidance of a waygate, those teleporting archways found at various points in the lands between, and arriving at the destination. The transit sound is very brief. Most players experience it as the audio of movement through the portal, but the specific tonal quality of that sound differs slightly depending on the destination of the waygate. Waygates that lead to sacred locations have a slightly warmer, more resonant transit tone. Waygates that lead to dangerous or corrupted areas have a slightly colder, more discordant one. This is an extraordinarily subtle distinction, and it is present only in the 1 or 2 seconds of the transit experience, which makes it practically impossible to notice unless you are specifically listening for it. The implication is that the waygates are not neutral infrastructure. They are invested with something, perhaps the residual energy of the places they connect to, perhaps the intent of whoever built them, that colors the experience of using them. The world is communicating something in those 2 seconds about where you are about to be. Almost no one hears it. Almost no one had reason to slow down enough in a transit moment, a moment defined by the absence of the player's normal engagement with the world, to listen to what the transition itself was saying. There is a pattern in the distribution of stone sword keys, those small, single-use items that unlock fog-sealed passages throughout the lands between, that most players experience as a resource management challenge and almost never examine as an intentional design statement. Stone sword keys are scarce relative to the number of sealed passages in the game. A player who uses every key they find on the first sealed passage they encounter will run into passages they cannot open later. This scarcity creates a decision structure that forces players to make choices about which sealed spaces are worth accessing. Most players make these choices based on what they expect the sealed space to contain. Rewards estimated from context, from surrounding lore, from the reputation of the area. But the specific sealed spaces that are most rewarding are not necessarily the ones that look most impressive from the outside. Some of the most significant content sealed behind stone sword keys is in locations that give no visual indication of their value. Modest-looking doorways in unremarkable corners of the world that open into spaces of extraordinary historical or narrative significance. The game deliberately decoupled the visual impressiveness of the seal from the value of what lies beyond it, which means players who use their keys efficiently based on outside appearances sometimes miss exactly the things the keys were designed to reveal. Conversely, players who use a key on an impulse, on a door that simply called to them for no reason they could articulate, sometimes find themselves standing inside something they did not expect. The Stone Sword key system rewards a kind of trust in instinct that the more analytical approach to resource management tends to suppress. There is a correspondence between the movement patterns of Erdtree roots visible in various locations throughout the world and the locations of underground spaces accessible below those surface points. The roots of the Erdtree, where they break through the surface of the ground in Limgrave and the Altus Plateau, always descend toward spaces that are accessible underground, toward the Siofra River, toward the Nokron Eternal City, toward the deep-root depths. This is geologically coherent. Roots grow where there is space and resource, and underground cavities provide both. But the direction of the roots and the angle at which they penetrate the surface is consistent in a way that allows a player who understands the pattern to predict, from the surface, where underground spaces might be located. This is a navigational system built into the world's visible geography. It is not labeled, it is not explained. It was placed there so that a player who looked at the surface of the lands between with enough attention would be able to orient themselves toward the underground without any in-game signposting. The roots are the map. The map is not in the game's official map system. It is in the direction that living things have grown in response to the same gravitational and spatial logic that shapes everything in the world. Learning to read it is learning to see the world the way the world itself sees. There is an aspect of the Tarnished's relationship with Melina, their guide, their flame of ambition, their complicated companion through the early portions of the game that most players experience as a narrative element and almost never examine in terms of what it implies about the world's design. Melina appears to the Tarnished without prior arrangement. She arrives when they first rest at a site of grace in Limgrave and offers them a partnership. She knows things about the lands between that the Tarnished does not. She has goals that she states honestly, and a history she is reluctant to share. Most players accept this arrangement as the game's tutorial and mentorship mechanism and move forward. But Melina's specific phrasing in her initial offer is worth examining. She says she has been waiting, not waiting for the tarnished specifically. She does not say that. She says she has been waiting for someone who carries grace. The distinction is meaningful. She was not waiting for this tarnished. She was waiting for the category of being that the tarnished represents, someone guided by the Erd tree's light toward the Erd tree's need. The tarnished who arrived was simply the one who arrived, not the one she necessarily would have chosen. This framing makes their partnership feel less like destiny and more like circumstance, two figures who found each other because the same force was directing both of them, and who became something to each other because they traveled the same road long enough. That is, in many ways, a more honest account of how meaningful relationships form than the destined partner narrative most games prefer. There is a quality to the lands between, at the point in the game when the Erd tree ignites, when the game's midpoint transformation occurs, and the world that the player has been navigating changes in a fundamental way that most players experience as a dramatic escalation of the narrative, and almost no player examines as a piece of ecological description. When the Erd tree burns, the world does not simply look different, it sounds different. The ambient audio of every region shifts. Wind patterns that had one character before the event have a different character after it. The temperature suggesting visual effects, the way heat shimmer appears at certain times of day, the way frost behaves on surfaces in the mountaintops, all change in ways that suggest the Erd tree's burning affected atmospheric conditions globally. This is world building of a scope that most games gesture toward, and few actually implement at the level of ambient detail. The Erd tree burning is not just a plot event. It is a physical event that the game's environment registers in dozens of small ways that were not necessary to include, but that were included because the world demanded them. The lands between is a coherent physical space, and physical spaces respond to the events that occur within them. The designers of Elden Ring committed to that coherence, even in details that most players would never notice, because a world that only responds to events the player is paying attention to is a different kind of world than one that responds to everything. There is something in the way that the game deploys silence immediately after a boss is defeated that most players overlook because the impulse following a difficult victory is to celebrate, to exhale, to move, not to remain still and listen. But in the seconds after a major boss falls, the ambient audio of the arena changes before the victory music begins. There is a gap, not a technical gap, not silence caused by system load, but a designed silence of 1 or 2 seconds in which the sound environment of the arena holds what just happened before the music arrives to interpret it. In that gap, the arena sounds like itself for the last time. Whatever ambient sound defined that space, the wind in the Altus Plateau castle courtyard, the volcanic rumble beneath Rykard's chamber, the peculiar subterranean resonance of the deep-root depths, plays without accompaniment, without music, without the player's combat audio. The space breathes once on its own terms before the game's narrative voice arrives to tell you what the victory means. Most players have never heard that breath because by the time the gap occurs, they are already moving, already looting, already thinking about what comes next. But it is there in every major encounter, a moment of pure environment that exists between the end of the fight and the beginning of the acknowledgement of it. There is a specific behavior exhibited by the giant crows found in the lands between, those enormous blackbirds found near the bestial sanctum in Shealed and at certain elevated locations in other regions, that goes unexamined because these creatures are typically treated as extremely threatening nuisances and dispatched as quickly as possible. But a crow that has not been agitated, Observed from a distance sufficient to avoid triggering its aggression, performs a daily cycle behavior that no combat-focused playstyle ever reveals. At certain times in the in-game day cycle, the large crows in Kylid face west and remain stationary for an extended period, oriented with some consistency toward the interior of the lands between, rather than outward toward the rot or upward toward the sky. Whether this is a navigational behavior, a territorial display, or something with lore significance is unclear from the behavior alone. But the crows of Kylid, in item descriptions associated with them, are connected to death rituals that predate the current age of the world. They were once considered sacred, or at least significant, in a tradition that no current NPC acknowledges and no quest illuminates. The west-facing behavior, combined with that background, suggests the behavior might be vestigial, a continued performance of something that had religious or ceremonial meaning in a tradition now completely lost. The crows in Kylid are very old. They are performing something they were taught before the rot arrived. They have not stopped because nothing capable of stopping them has arrived either. There is a mechanic in the way that flasks replenish, specifically in the way that defeating enemies in sufficient numbers causes a partial replenishment of flask charges without resting at a grace that most players understand functionally, but few investigate philosophically. The replenishment system is understood as a tactical resource. Kill enough enemies and recover some health, which allows for sustained exploration between graces. The logic behind it, from a pure game design perspective, is clear, but the lore justification for why killing enemies replenishes the grace granted to the Tarnished through their flasks is not stated anywhere directly. It can be inferred through the accumulations of item descriptions that the Tarnished's connection to grace is not a static resource, but a dynamic relationship. That grace responds to what the Tarnished does and replenishes itself when the Tarnished demonstrates a quality the Erdtree values. The defeat of enemies, specifically the reclaiming of the lands between from the disorder that followed the shattering, is exactly the kind of action the Erdtree's grace would recognize and respond to. The flask charges are not a health resource in a purely mechanical sense. They are the Erdtree's acknowledgement of the Tarnished's purpose, renewed each time that purpose is actively demonstrated. The game plays this as a tactical system. The lore makes it an ongoing dialogue between the Tarnished and the Divine. There is a location in Stormvale Castle, specifically a section of the outer walls accessible only by a specific routing that the game's level design does not naturally encourage, where the stonework of the castle wall gives way to significantly older stonework of a markedly different style. This transition is visible only at a specific stretch of exterior wall, reachable only by navigating a sequence of ledges that most players bypass by following the more obvious interior routes. The older stonework visible at that section is not the architecture of Stormvale. It is the architecture of something older, something that existed on that cliff face before Stormvale was built there, and the castle's builders incorporated it rather than removing it, because whatever was already there was too substantial to demolish. What was built on that cliff before Stormvale is not named anywhere. The style of the older stonework does not match any identified faction or time period in a way that NPC dialogue or item descriptions can confirm. But its presence there, underneath and partly within the structure of the most prominent fortress in Limgrave, implies that the location itself, the cliff, the promontory, the specific geographic position overlooking the land, was considered significant long before Godric's family built their claim upon it. Strategic significance is sometimes geographic rather than political, and the oldest layer of Stormvale's wall remembers a time when the place was important for reasons the current world has completely forgotten. There is something in the visual presentation of the frenzied flame prescription, the underground space where the three fingers await those who seek the frenzied flame that most players process as extremity of art direction, and almost no player reads as philosophy. The space is defined by its visual language of exposure. The player must remove all equipment before the three fingers will reveal themselves, and the environmental design of the space reinforces this. Bare stone, no adornment, the absence of anything that could be called decoration. This is not simply poverty of design. It is intentional. The frenzied flame's philosophical position, as articulated in the lore associated with it, is that distinction is the source of suffering, that the categories humans create between themselves and between things are what make violence possible. The architecture of the prescription embeds this philosophy. A space without decoration is a space without hierarchy, without the visual communication of whose stone this is, what power built it, what ideology ordained it. It is, architecturally, the most honest space in the game, stone cut for purpose, nothing beyond purpose, nothing that says this belongs to someone and not to someone else. The frenzied flame is a catastrophic belief. Its promised outcome is dissolution rather than liberation. But the architecture of the space where it is encountered is built on a philosophical premise that is not easily dismissed, that all the things built above it, all the decorated and hierarchical and adorned spaces of the lands between, are built in distinctions that cost someone something. The prescription is what it looks like to take that critique seriously enough to embody it in stone. There is a quality to the ambient music that plays in the Siofra River, the vast underground expanse beneath Limgrave, that most players receive as beautiful and mysterious, without examining what specifically produces those qualities in the audio. The Siofra River's music was composed by Yuka Kitamura, and it uses a technique that is unusual in the context of the rest of the game's soundtrack. It incorporates silences not as gaps between phrases, but as structural elements, as components of the music, rather than absences from it. The silences are timed. They last specific durations that are consistent across multiple plays of the ambient track. This is not music that trails off in the way ambient music typically trails off. It is music that specifically ends certain phrases with a held silence, as a singer might hold a breath before continuing. The effect of this technique in the Siofra River is to make the space feel like it is breathing, like the music and the silence are both part of the underground atmosphere, rather than the music simply playing over it. The Siofra River is a place where the living world descends into something older and stranger, and the music built for it acknowledges that both qualities, the living and the ancient, are simultaneously present. The breathing silences are the ancient part. The melodic phrases are the living part. Together, they describe a space that is caught between what it was and what it is, which is the most accurate description possible of what the underground of the lands between actually is. There is a hidden correspondence in the way that the two major boss fights considered the hardest in Elden Ring, Millennia and the Elden Beast, are designed that most players who have experienced both never articulate even to themselves, because the emotional register of each fight is so different that the structural similarity is obscured by the experiential distance between them. Millennia is intimate. She is one person. She is fought in a space that, while large, is bounded in a way that keeps the player and the boss in constant visual relationship. The Elden Beast is vast. It is fought in a space that seems to have no walls, a starry void of enormous scale, and the boss itself is so large that the player spends significant portions of the fight simply trying to close distance. But both fights share a structural logic. They are organized around the principle of learning to move toward what you fear rather than away from it. Millennia's most dangerous attack, her Scarlet Ionia dive, creates a large area of danger that the correct response to is to move into rather than away from, to stay aggressive in the moment of maximum apparent threat. The Elden Beast's most dangerous phases are the ones in which it moves to distance, and the correct response is to relentlessly pursue it, rather than managing distance from a safe remove. Both fights teach the same lesson at their core, that the instinct to retreat in the face of what is overwhelming is precisely the instinct that will kill you. The hardest things in the lands between reward the willingness to move toward them. That is not an accident. There is a detail in the final moments of the journey's ending, the ending in which the tarnished simply walks into the Erd Tree to be consumed by it, rather than claiming the Elden Ring or following any other path that almost no player has seen, because this ending requires the specific choices that most players do not make on their first or second or third playthrough. The ending itself is brief and understated, which is appropriate for what it is. The choice to disappear rather than to rule, to contribute rather than to reign. But in the final seconds of the animation, before the screen goes to black, there is a visual detail that is easy to miss, because the attention is usually drawn to the larger spectacle of the Erd Tree's interior light. The detail is the tarnished's hands. In those last seconds, the hands are visible, and the golden light of the Erd Tree is beginning to pass through them, not illuminating them, but passing through them, as though they are becoming the same substance as the light itself. The tarnished is not being destroyed by the Erd Tree, they are becoming indistinguishable from it. This is the ending of the tarnished, who understood that their purpose was not to hold power, but to feed it, who chose to become part of something larger rather than to control it. The visual language of that final moment is available only to the people patient enough to look at their character's hands at the precise moment when most people are looking at the tree. There is an aspect of Fia, the deathbed companion found at the Roundtable hold, who offers the tarnished the chance to be embraced, that most players understand in mechanical terms. She offers a small vigor debuff in exchange for an item that has limited uses. This exchange is understood quickly, evaluated for efficiency, and either accepted or declined according to the player's priorities. But Fia's questline, followed to its conclusion in the deep-root depths, reveals a purpose for those embraces that changes their meaning retroactively. Fia collects the death of those she holds. She is not offering comfort as a primary function. She is gathering something from the people who accept her embrace, something connected to the death force that the Erd Tree has suppressed, and that she, in service to a different vision of the world, is trying to accumulate and concentrate. This means that every embrace the tarnished accepts from Fia is, in lore terms, an act of giving rather than receiving. The tarnished is not being comforted. They are contributing something, the residue of all their deaths, all the times the grace returned them, and the thing that would have been their permanent death was instead redirected to Fia's project. The mechanical debuff is the game's representation of the cost of this transaction, but the cost is not what most players think it is. They are not losing vigor. They are giving death to someone who needs it. The lands between has a way of making every transaction more complicated than it appears on its surface. There is something in the way that Gurunk Beast Clergyman, the enormous, fanged creature found at the Bestial Sanctum in Caelid, who exchanges death roots for powerful incantations, behaves across multiple visits that most players do not register as a character arc. Gurunk is hostile when the player first enters a certain range with a death root to offer. This hostility is brief. He restrains himself, accepts the transaction, and the exchange occurs. But on subsequent visits, as the player brings more death roots, Gurunk's restraint becomes more difficult. his pre-transaction aggression becomes more pronounced. He attacks the player at a certain point in the quest line before calming and completing the exchange. What this progression documents, across the visits that most players space far apart and experience as disconnected transactions, is the deterioration of self-control in a being who is consuming something that destabilizes it. Gurunk is eating death roots because doing so is his function. He contains and neutralizes the death force they carry. But the accumulation of that death force is changing him. His difficulty controlling his aggression is not random. It is the documentary record of what containment costs. By the time the questline reaches the revelation of who Gurunk actually is, a truth that arrives quietly, without announcement, for players who follow the story far enough, what seemed like a simple exchange of items for incantations reveals itself as the portrait of a figure trying to perform a sacred function while being slowly undone by it. There is a visual detail in the design of the Roundtable hold that reveals something about who the hold was designed to accommodate that the game's current use of the space as a hub for the Tarnished does not fully explain. The furniture in the hold is sized slightly larger than the Tarnished characters who occupy it. The chairs are too wide. The table in the central room has a height that is comfortable for someone taller and broader than any of the NPCs seated around it. This is not a universal feature of the hold's design. Some elements are proportioned normally for human-scale figures, but the central gathering furniture in the hold's primary space was built for someone larger. Whether this implies the hold was originally designed for the demigods, for the scions of Marika, who were uniformly described as enormous relative to ordinary human scale, or for some other category of inhabitant, is not stated anywhere. But the evidence of the furniture suggests that the hold was built with a gathering in mind that did not occur, that the space was prepared for a meeting that never happened, or that happened once and then ceased, and the Tarnished who now use the hold are occupying a space designed for something they are not. The chairs are too big. The table is too high. The hold was made ready for visitors who did not arrive. There is a final dimension to the experience of the lands between that comes from stepping back far enough to see the entire game's world not as a setting for adventure but as a record, as something that was made by the people who lived in it, in the way that all made things carry the marks of the people who made them. Every ruin in Elden Ring was built before it was ruined. Every abandoned home had a family. Every deserted road was once traveled by people who had places to go and reasons to get there. The game did not invent these histories wholesale for the purpose of player entertainment. It built a world with the depth of a real history, the kind of history that real places accumulate through the ordinary pressure of time, and then placed the player inside the aftermath of that history, surrounded by its evidence, asked to make of it what they could. What the 1% of players find in this world is not a hidden layer of content that other players miss. It is the world as it was always available to be seen, as a place built by people who cared about every surface, every sound, every moment of light through a particular window at a particular time of day. The secrets are distributed everywhere, which means they are available to anyone. Thus the difference is only in the willingness to be slow and curious and present enough to receive them. Thanks for watching. If these stories helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.